They built a $1.7 billion steel tomb to contain the most dangerous object on the Earth. It was supposed to buy us a century of safety, but there is one problem. That thing inside is disappearing. The elephant's foot, the radioactive mass beneath Chernobyl, is slowly turning into microscopic radioactive dust. Dust that can slip through cracks, ride air currents, and bypass the very shield designed to trap it. The new Safe Confinement was built to trap a monster. Instead, that monster is becoming a ghost that can walk through walls. If scientists lose control of what's happening beneath Chernobyl, this disaster could enter a terrifying new phase. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Filter. Imagine an aircraft hangar the size of a small city block, rising 35 stories high and weighing nearly 40,000 tons. That is the new Safe Containment, or NSC, in a nutshell. It is a gleaming arch of steel, 843 feet wide and 356 feet tall. It doesn't sit on top of the reactor directly, it sits on top of the original confinement structure, a concrete shell that Soviet workers frantically built over the wreckage in the months after the 1986 disaster. They called the first structure the sarcophagus, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds, like a pharaoh's tomb. It was built to seal something dangerous inside forever. Unlike the Egyptian tombs, the original encasement was built with all the structural integrity you would expect from something built in a panic. By the 2000s, it was cracking, rain was seeping in, and the entire structure was at risk of collapse. So the world built the NSC to encase the sarcophagus, a confinement structure around a confinement structure, like a hazmat suit pulled over a broken bandage. It is the world's largest movable land-based object, per one recent report. But it's far from a giant steel box sitting over the old reactor. It's alive, in a sense, constantly breathing. Massive ventilation systems pull air inward, passing it through industrial filtration units, and it maintains what engineers call negative pressure inside of the structure. Negative pressure is just a fancy way of saying the building is always inhaling and never exhaling. Air flows in, nothing flows out. At least nothing that hasn't first been passed through a filter designed to catch whatever toxins the ruins below are shedding. The filters are the critical line. Filters used in hospital operating rooms, the gold standard for clean air environments, can catch particles as small as 0.3 microns. That's roughly 3,000ths the width of a single hair. At that scale, you're stopping bacteria, smoke, and the overwhelming majority of radioactive dust particles floating around inside of the shelter. And the NSC's filtration systems are extremely good at it. These are not some giant furnace filters from Home Depot. They use dense mats of tangled fibers that trap particles through multiple mechanisms at once. Some slam directly into the fibers while others brush against them and stick, and the tiniest particles zigzag erratically through the air until they collide with the filter material through a process called Brownian motion. Ironically, the smallest particles are often easier to trap than the medium-sized ones. These filters reveal something terrifying. The NSC was never designed because Chernobyl was stable. It was designed because scientists knew the materials in Reactor 4 were still falling apart and crumbling into radioactive dust. Even then, what researchers began to see inside confinement was still unsettling. Sensors detected an increasing number of neutrons ricocheting around like, quote, the embers in a barbecue pit. At that point, this was more of a persistent danger. They knew they could have a problem. Not imminently dangerous, but one that gnaws at you simply because those neutron spikes weren't supposed to be happening. They were supposed to, quote, wink out on their own. And that feeling, knowing that something is wrong, but not knowing exactly how serious it is or what happens next, is something people can understand in a much more personal way too. Because sometimes stress doesn't arrive as one huge explosion. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It builds up in the background, keeps changing, and makes it hard to know what to do next. That's one reason therapy can be so valuable. It gives you space to slow down, sort through what you're feeling, and take one step at a time instead of treating everything like it has to be all or nothing. Therapy has helped me take what feels like a huge problem and break it down into something a lot more manageable. It's helped me focus on what I can do right now and make things less overwhelming. And that's why I'm glad BetterHelp is sponsoring this video. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. You can take a quick quiz and get matched with a licensed therapist. And if it doesn't feel like the right fit, you can switch anytime at no extra cost. You can also communicate in whatever feels the most comfortable for you, whether that's phone, video, or text. Sometimes progress isn't about fixing everything all at once. Sometimes it's just about having the support and perspective to move forward a little more clearly. So if you've been thinking about trying therapy, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/infographics to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now back to Chernobyl. The original expectation was that this degradation process would gradually stabilize over time. Instead, measurements inside the shelter suggested something far more unpredictable. The environment remained active and dynamic. It was still changing decades after the explosion. In theory, the damaged core should mostly produce coarse radioactive particles, fragments, debris, and heavy dust. This is the kind of contamination modern industrial filtration systems are designed to capture relatively easily. But scientists were also detecting increases in neutron activity in several subreactor rooms. And that was a concern. It suggested the fuel-containing material wasn't just physically falling apart, its physical evolution was actually sparking new nuclear reactions. It was cracking, shifting, drying out, and rearranging in ways that triggered new fission. This made its long-term behavior increasingly difficult to predict. Chernobyl's Unit 4 reactor core hasn't really stopped since 1986. A chemical concoction far more sinister than ordinary debris is bubbling away. When Reactor 4 exploded, its core melted together like lava, fusing the reactor's uranium fuel, control rods, metal cladding, and a molten mixture of concrete, steel, zirconium, graphite, and even sand into a new substance called corium. Peaking at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the corium mass flowed downward, hardened into stalagmites and stalactites and lava flows, and it became what scientists call fuel-containing materials, or FCM. They still hold about 95% of the reactor's original uranium. Under the right conditions, that mass can still flirt with one thing Chernobyl was never supposed to do again: sustain a nuclear reaction. In 2021, scientists published multiple reports stating that these FCMs were actively disintegrating, producing a radioactive dust that complicated original plans to dismantle the original sarcophagus. Today, the elephant's foot, the most famous of those formations, is more or less the consistency of hard, compacted sand. The NSC is doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep particles in. The problem is that what's inside is no longer behaving like what the design assumed. Something has changed inside the confinement. That's the thread we need to start pulling, and to understand where it leads, we'll have to go back to the night everything began and reckon with the possibility that what we've been told about that night has always been missing something. Chapter 2. The nature of the first explosion. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 was running a routine safety test that felt anything but routine. It was being pushed into unstable territory to see what happens when the power goes out. Soviet operators juggled with alarms, overrides, and a reactor that was already behaving like it had a mind of its own. Soon, the power dipped too low and then spiked fast. Too fast. The official story says what happened next was simple. Water inside the reactor flashed to steam. Pressure built. The resulting explosion blew the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor like a champagne cork. As the core was exposed, graphite ignited, and the subsequent fire burned for 10 days. That's the version the Soviet Union gave the world. It is in the textbooks. It is the story. But there's a problem. Somewhere else, nearly 620 miles away, in the Russian city of Chernobyl, scientists were detecting something strange in the air: radioactive xenon gas. Now, xenon doesn't just show up for no reason. It's a fission product which gives a unique calling card, a fingerprint if you will, and this fingerprint didn't match the official story. This specific mix of xenon isotopes they found wasn't consistent with a damaged reactor slowly falling apart. It pointed to something more violent, an intense burst of nuclear fission happening right at the moment of the explosion. Swedish physicist Lars-Erik de Geer looked into this decades later. Using atmospheric models, he traced the xenon cloud's origins and, more importantly, how it got there. It did not follow the main plume drifting toward Europe. It shot high into the atmosphere, caught by a completely different wind current, and that only happens if something launches material upward with extreme force, far more than a steam explosion alone. De Geer's conclusion: the first blast wasn't just a steam explosion, it was a literal nuclear explosion. A rapid, uncontrolled burst of fission ripped through parts of the core first, and then seconds later the steam explosion finished the job, tearing the reactor apart. Think of it like pulling a trigger before a bomb goes off. That first blast might have been small by comparison, but it was nuclear in nature, and that matters. Whatever produced that burst did not vanish when the dust settled. Its fingerprints are still locked inside the melted core, inside the fuel-containing materials. The Gears theory isn't universally accepted, but it raised a question that refuses to go away. If Chernobyl went briefly nuclear before it went mechanical, what exactly is down there? Chapter 3, Room 3052, The Pulse. Deep beneath Reactor 4, past shattered concrete and twisted steel and into a maze no humans can safely enter, lies Room 3052. It sounds harmless, but don't let that deceive you. This is the room where part of the reactor ended up when the glowing corium slurry ate its way downward like lava and then cooled. Whatever is down there has been sitting in the dark since 1986, but not quietly. Nobody can go back down to check. The radiation would kill you in minutes. So scientists did the next best thing. They wired the room with sensors and they let the reactor core speak for itself. If you want to know whether nuclear fission is happening somewhere, you count the neutrons. Every time a uranium atom splits, it fires off neutrons like microscopic bullets. Those neutrons hit other atoms, splitting them, releasing more neutrons, a chain reaction. The more neutrons you detect, the more fission is happening. So when the sensors in room 3052 started picking up more neutrons, people paid attention. Between 2016 and 2021, neutron levels jumped by roughly 40%, in some cases nearly double. The leading suspect was water. For decades, groundwater seeped into the ruins. Oddly enough, that helped keep things stable. Water actually slows neutrons down, and slower neutrons are more likely to cause fission, but water also absorbs them, and it acts as both an accelerator and a brake. For years, the brake was winning. And then came the NSC. By sealing the reactor and controlling the environment, it reduced the amount of groundwater getting into the system. Less water means less braking. If you could picture a campfire buried under wet ash for decades, silently smoldering and barely alive, you might get a sense of what's going on. When the ash dries out, whatever's underneath will start to glow again. To be clear, this is not a second Chernobyl explosion waiting to happen. Most experts think the geometry of the material doesn't allow for that kind of runaway reaction. If things heat up too much, the system would likely choke itself off. But they don't know for sure. Nobody does. What they do know for sure is that the core is not dead. It is reacting, generating new fission, radiation, and heat. And that energy doesn't stay buried forever. It moves upwards. A few kilometers away on the surface, something else was about to disturb the ground above Reactor 4, without any idea of what might be waking up underneath. Chapter 4, The Red Forest Disturbance. A few miles from Reactor 4, there's a forest that shouldn't exist, and that's because in 1986 it allegedly died. The radiation hit it so hard that the pine trees turned a rusted orange-red almost overnight. Then they collapsed where they stood. Bulldozers came through, they buried what they could, and they left the rest to rot. They called it the Red Forest, and today it looks eerily normal. On the surface, trees have grown back, birds fly through it, and the wind moves through the branches like any other forest on the earth. But go underground and the forest reveals roots far more sinister. For nearly 5 decades, the soil has been quietly collecting everything Chernobyl threw into the air. That includes radioactive dust, fallout, ionizing particles carried by the rain and the wind, and anything else the violent explosion cycled into the environment over and over. Layer by layer, it remains one of the most contaminated places on the Earth. And in February 2022, Russian tanks rolled straight through it. Putin's armored columns, part of his special military operation to invade Ukraine, pushed toward Kyiv by cutting right across the exclusion zone. Heavily tracked vehicles churned the soil, digging, grinding, and kicking up decades of radioactive material into the air as a consequence. The local plant workers could only watch until their sensors started lighting up. Radiation monitors began reporting spikes. Some stations registered gamma levels 20, even 30 times higher than normal, which is not very subtle. When scientists went back and they looked closely at the data, however, the pattern didn't make sense. Some sensors far from the military convoy spiked, while others closer by didn't. A 2023 study dug into the readings and completely debunked the dust theory. The sensors were spiking miles away from the roads. In other words, where the tanks definitely kicked up radioactive dust locally, that physical dust didn't cause the massive sensor spikes. Their electronic warfare weapons likely scrambled the network. Despite that, the chemical toxicity of the soil is actually getting worse. Back in 1986, the fallout included a radioactive isotope called plutonium-241. It doesn't stick around forever. It actually decays relatively quickly. What it turns into when it does decay is the real problem. Americium-241, longer-lived, more persistent, and in some ways more dangerous as it emits alpha radiation. It won't travel far in the air, but if it does get inside your body, it'll dump the energy straight into your cells. Your lung tissue, your bones, anywhere it settles, it'll keep irradiating, converting into something nastier. Whatever those tanks kicked up in 2022, it was not the same material that fell in 1986. It was something even more toxic and refined. And not everything in the red forest stays on the surface or in the air. Some of it sinks down through the soil and into the groundwater spaces beneath the reactor, the same spaces where room 3052 is showing signs of renewed life. Chapter 5: The Invisible Highway. Everything we've talked about so far, the radiation, the dust, the molten fuel, it all seemed contained. But beneath the exclusion zone is a hidden system of underground rivers, layers of water-bearing rock and soil called aquifers. When rain falls, it seeps into the ground and begins a slow journey through those aquifers all the way to the Dnieper River. It's the main water source for Kyiv, home to 3 million people and tens of millions more across the region. If you'd asked scientists back in 1986 whether anything from Chernobyl was getting into that system, they'd have had a reassuring answer. Under the site is a thick layer of clay, and clay is dense and sticky, almost impermeable actually. They hoped that anything that hit that clay barrier would be stopped dead in its tracks, or at least move so slowly that the radiation would decay away long before it reached anything important. There was a huge problem though. When later surveys found out that the original models didn't recognize that Chernobyl's clay wasn't actually solid, it was laced with cracks and threaded with tiny pathways where the water could slip through. The water flowing through those cracks was carrying passengers too. Scientists called them colloids, basically microscopic particles suspended in the water, too small to settle and too big to ignore. The most important part is that radioactive elements love them. Plutonium, for example, was supposed to stay locked into the soil, basically immobile, but in this case it started hitching rides, clinging on to those tiny particles and moving with the water. It slipped through fractures, bypassed natural barriers, and traveled farther and faster than anyone predicted. The original safety models imagined contamination slowly crawling through the dirt. What they found instead were waterborne highways, whose eventual reach proved virtually impossible to measure. A long-term study published in 2022 confirmed that radioactive elements like cesium, strontium, and even plutonium are already present in the groundwater beneath Chernobyl. The system does dilute and slow them down over time, but the transport mechanisms are more complicated than anyone thought. Containment worked, just not the way we thought it would, with the system connecting outward through deep aquifers and regional geology. It feeds into the same watershed supplying one of Europe's largest populations. Every part of this points back to one place, the source, where something inside the reactor is still alive and producing material that isn't behaving in the way it's supposed to. Chapter 6: The Sarcophagus Myth. By this point, it's safe to say that Chernobyl's core is not behaving like a dead object. The logic of the NSC was just to buy some time. It was temporary, a 100-year shelter designed so engineers could eventually dismantle the ruins. But that plan rested on a single assumption that the nuclear reactions were finished. And to be fair, the NSC itself works beautifully. Its steel arches are structurally sound, the ventilation system runs well, the filtration systems operate exactly within their specifications. Engineering is not a problem. The problem is that the engineers designed the structure for a dormant, decaying reactor, and Chernobyl did not read the manual. The NSC was built to stop radioactive dust escaping from a static solid mass. Instead, scientists are increasingly dealing with something more like a chemically unstable radioactive glass monster that keeps crumbling, shifting, reacting, and occasionally throwing off little hints that nuclear fission may still be occurring underground. It is not ideal. And that's really the story here. The neutron spikes, the groundwater contamination, weird aerosol particles, they're all symptoms and evidence of something physical happening inside the reactor core itself. If the core were truly inert and the original models held, these signals would be fading, not evolving, and sometimes getting stronger 40 years later. So scientists went back to the source, back to the molten remains of Reactor 4. What they found was worse than simple contamination. Chapter 7: The Disintegrating Foot. All of this brings us back to where we started, the elephant's foot. After all this time, it remains one of the deadliest objects humanity has ever created. Look at a photo of it, and you're apt to just think of it as a rock. A big radioactive rock, except it's really radioactive glass. And that is a horrifyingly important distinction. Back in 1986, Reactor 4 got so hot that everything inside the reactor melted together into glowing sludge that flowed through the reactor building like lava. When it cooled, the most famous chunk became the elephant's foot, and for years scientists assumed the massive black formation of uranium-rich silicate glass packed with radioactive isotopes was mostly finished changing. Another bad assumption, since glass is not permanent, and radioactive glass is basically being beaten to death from the inside by its own atoms. Every radioactive decay event inside of the foot releases energy in the form of alpha particles, gamma rays, and beta decay. These tiny microscopic impacts hammer the material non-stop for decades. It is just enough to slowly pulverize the mass and not make it explode dramatically. But bond by bond, atom by atom, the mass evolves. Eventually things are bound to crack, and that's what scientists are seeing. Back in the 1990s, the elephant's foot looked so dense and permanent that scientists needed to use a Kalashnikov rifle with armor-piercing rounds just to chip off a sample for analysis. Today, scientists say parts of it have the consistency of sand, and that is not what you want from your run-of-the-mill radioactive lava. The dust that sheds off the sand is crumbling in a way that makes all the latest aerosol readings make better sense. But it gets worse. As the material fractures internally, the uranium trapped inside shifts position. Concentrations rearrange as pockets form, and in certain conditions, as the reactor spaces dry out, that rearrangement may help explain the rising neutron activity scientists detected in room 3052. The core is aging very badly, like a toxic jello mold slowly turning itself into airborne powder while sitting on top of Europe's water table. The removal plan, well, it's still under development, and that's the uncomfortable reality sitting under the largest movable structure on the Earth. Chernobyl is not asleep, it's awake, and it's grinding itself into something even harder to contain than the day we sealed it away. But to understand why it ended up like this in the first place, you have to go back to the moment everything failed and the mistakes that were made. 60 minutes to 0 hour. It's like any other night in the control room of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The room buzzes with life as machines hum and lights flicker. Dials and gauges monitor the pressure and the temperature inside the reactor. 25-year-old Leonid Toptunov is the senior control engineer tonight. He's only been in the role for 2 months, and now he's overseeing a safety test, one delayed from the previous day. The goal is to see if the reactor's turbines can keep the water pumps running in the event of a critical failure. Carefully, he begins to lower the reactor's power. Toptunov's eyes are fixed on the reactor output. Beside him stands Alexander Akimov, the shift's foreman, and Anatoly Dyatlov, the plant's deputy chief engineer. The men move through their normal procedures. Everything feels routine. Everything feels safe. The workers inside belong to a special group of experts providing power to a nation. But that feeling won't last. 55 minutes to 0 hour. The mood in the room changes. The power is dropping too fast. The reactor is not acting the way the book said it should. Inside the core, xenon gas is building up, and it acts like a sponge, soaking up the tiny particles that keep the nuclear fire going. Too much xenon and the reactor starts to choke. Power collapses. Akimov tells Dyatlov that they should stop and wait for the gas to clear. Dyatlov ignores the warning. He snaps at Toptunov, ordering him to prepare for the test. Under the hard glare of his superior, Toptunov gives in. It's a move that will change history. 52 minutes to 0 hour. The shrill of alarms fills the control room. The power has dropped below the safety limit. Toptunov works the switches as fast as he can. There is only one way to bring the reactor back to a stable level. They have to pull the control rods out. It is the only way to force the reaction back up, but it's also extremely dangerous. 50 minutes to 0 hour. Toptunov removes the control rods. The screens show the power is slowly starting to climb back up, but it's still far below what the test plan calls for. Dyatlov says it's enough. 1 mile away in the town of Pripyat, 49,360 people are soundly asleep. They have no idea about the devastation coming their way. 45 minutes to 0 hour. As Toptunov attempts to switch the reactor from local to automatic control, the power doesn't just drop, it stops. The digital displays flicker. The numbers tumble. The reactor is almost flatlined. The center of the reactor is clogged with xenon. Normally, the reactor would be shut down for 24 hours to allow the xenon to decay. But tonight, Dyatlov cannot wait. A successful test tonight could see him promoted to chief engineer, and with it a salary increase. He has no idea that the heat is building at the bottom of the reactor faster than the sensors can even track. 30 minutes to 0 hour. Inside the reactor vessel, beneath a 1,000-ton steel lid, the uranium fuel rods are now exposed. Water levels swing wildly. The rods grow hotter and hotter, starting to glow red as the cooling water struggles to keep up. The concrete floors begin to vibrate. Back in the control room, Dyatlov is satisfied. They have managed to crawl the power back up. But what he doesn't realize is that Reactor 4 is now a bomb with a ticking fuse. 22 minutes to 0 hour. It's 1:01 a.m. In the rush to keep the power up, Akimov and Toptunov unknowingly drain the last bit of control they have left. Regulations demand a minimum number of control rods remain in the core. Effectively, the reactor's breaks. But the computer readout is flashing a warning. They're down to 18 rods, close enough to disaster that one wrong move could tip everything. Just minutes later, Akimov orders the activation of 2 additional main circulating pumps. More water equals more cooling, but the result is a nightmare. A massive surge of cold water into the core causes the steam pressure to plummet. Dyatlov demands the men bypass the automatic shutdown signals that are screaming because of the low water levels. The safety of the entire plant is now hanging by a thread. 20 minutes to 0 hour. The reactor desperately needs water. Too little and the core will overheat and bend out of shape. Too much and the water can surge into the turbines, shattering the blades. It's a fine balancing act. In the control room, alarms for low water blare. Senior control engineer Boris Stolyarchuk doesn't flinch. His eyes stay on the numbers. The plant is required to hit its annual output target. That is the job. That's what matters. 15 minutes to 0 hour. Inside the core, a terrifying chain reaction is beginning. With most of the control rods withdrawn, the bottom of the reactor has turned into a superheated zone. Temperatures climbing toward 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam bubbles begin to form in the cooling water. In most reactors, those bubbles would slow the reaction down. But in the Chernobyl reactor, they speed it up. It's a deadly design flaw the engineers were never told about, born from a cost-saving decision back in the 1960s. Energy is building at the base of the reactor, and the men in the control room have no idea. They are minutes away from crossing the point of no return. 5 minutes to 0 hour. The control room is a flurry of activity as they prepare to begin the test. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov work together, moving switches and turning dials. Actions that are quietly setting the stage for a nightmare. They have bypassed the emergency core cooling system and disabled the low-power protection locks. It's the only way to get the data Moscow demands. The men think they're in control. They are wrong. In the turbine hall, Sasha Yevchenko checks the machinery as he moves deeper into the building, straight toward disaster. High above him, Valery Perevoshenko, the foreman on duty, starts climbing the stairs toward the reactor hall. He has no idea what he is walking into. 1 minute to 0 hour. The test begins. The steam valves to turbine number 8 are shut. The massive machine starts to wind down. In the control room, the men stare at the dials. This is their narrow window, the moment they have been waiting for. They're counting on the turbine's momentum, hoping it can keep the cooling pumps alive until the diesel generators take over. As the pumps slow, the volume of water flowing through the reactor drops. The water that remains begins to boil violently. Steam bubbles form at the bottom of the core. Each bubble is a tiny pocket of disaster. The reactor is now trapped in a lethal feedback loop. More steam means more reactivity. More reactivity means more heat. More heat means even more steam. In the control room, instruments begin to flicker with news the operators don't want to see. The numbers on the screen start to climb faster and faster, and then they shoot upwards. 20 seconds to 0 hour. Akimov sees the jump. The power is climbing too fast, surging past the safety limits. He doesn't panic, his training kicks in. The AZ-5 button is hit. The reactor emergency protection system activates. It's the emergency shutdown, the scram command. It's supposed to end the test and stop the reactor cold, but tonight it does the opposite. As the rods begin to drop, the graphite tips hit the core first, and graphite doesn't slow the reaction down, it accelerates it. For a split second, the AZ-5 button acts as a kickstarter. The reactor's power output explodes past anything the building was ever meant to handle. In the reactor hall, Valery Perevoshenko stares at the massive steel lid meant to keep the reactor sealed shut. And then he sees it. The fuel caps are moving. A roar comes from the reactor. Valery doesn't wait to understand it. He runs. 0 hour. The control room is rocked by a massive explosion. Men are thrown off their feet. Dust falls from the ceiling as the building groans. Before anyone can move, a second explosion tears through the plant. It's equivalent to a 10-ton TNT detonation. The force is so violent it rips the roof clean off of the building, launching it nearly 100 feet into the air before it crashes back down into the open mouth of the core. The control room is suddenly filled with white dust and the scream of escaping steam. Ceiling panels collapse, raining heavy debris down on the men. A strange metallic taste floods their mouth as radiation tears through the air. 6 tons of nuclear fuel has just been blasted into the night sky. 1 minute after 0 hour. Flashlight beams cut through the thick dust in the control room. Alexander Akimov forces himself to believe the reactor is still intact, that the explosion was just a minor gas blast, not the core. He stares at his gauges, but they're dead. The needles are frozen at the highest point or stuck at 0. A worker bursts in from the turbine hall. There's a fire. Akimov alerts the fire station and the chiefs of the other departments, initiating emergency protocols to stabilize the plant. It's now a race against time. 5 minutes after 0 hour. Dyatlov is the first to stumble into the hallway, unable to comprehend the devastation in front of him. Pieces of the core lie scattered on the ground, glowing in the dark. In the control room, Akimov tries the internal phones. Nothing. The lines are dead. He has to send men physically to make contact in the plant. A soot-covered Sasha Yevchenko finds Dyatlov and blurts out that the roof is gone. Dyatlov ignores him, barking in order to get to the cooling pumps. Akimov sends junior engineers to the manual rod controls. He refuses to accept that the reactor is gone. The men step into a labyrinth of pitch-black corridors where the air is a thick metallic soup of scalding steam and radioactive dust. They wade through knee-deep water and climb over massive twisted steel beams. When they reach the reactor hall, the enormity finally hits them. The roof is gone. Above them, the night sky is clear, filled with stars. And rising from the shattered reactor is a shimmering pillar of violet blue light. The first firemen arrive at the plant. They have no radiation suits, only canvas coats, gloves, and helmets. In front of them lies black gravel scattered across the ground, and they start to kick it aside without a second thought. They believe they're walking into a normal rooftop fire. None of them realize it yet, but they are already dying. 10 minutes after 0 hour. Inside the control room, Akimov is still ordering water to be pumped into the reactor that has been torn apart. He and Toltunov stay at their posts, breathing in radioactive dust, unaware their skin is already beginning to blister and darken. The physical signs of radiation sickness begin to hit. Operators start to vomit uncontrollably. Their heads throb, the pressure building inside of their skulls. Dyatlov still refuses to accept the truth and wanders the plant, stepping over pieces of the core that have been blasted out of the building. Akimov starts calling for feed water pumps, trying to force water into a system that is dead. Someone notices the hydrogen problem. Procedures start, venting, clearing, anything to stop a second disaster. 1 mile away, the people of Pripyat are woken by the sound of sirens. From their balconies, they watch a rainbow of colors dancing over Reactor 4. Blues, greens, and purples, mesmerized by the strange beauty of it all. They don't realize that invisible deadly dust is already drifting down onto their streets. 20 minutes after 0 hour. In the control room, Akimov calls his superiors. He tells them the reactor is intact. That one lie will keep 50,000 people trapped in the danger zone for more than a day. The engineers in that room are already doomed. Akimov and Toptunov keep fighting, desperately trying to pump water into the core, unaware that the pipes are ruptured in several places. The water never reaches the reactor. It floods the lower levels of the plant instead, turning everything it touches radioactive. Anatoly Dyatlov rushes into the turbine hall and finally sees the damage for himself. Chunks of graphite are scattered across the floor like black gravel, each block emitting lethal radiation. He returns to the control room and writes in the logbook that the reactor is still in one piece. Akimov realizes the truth. He looks through a broken wall at the smoke rising from the giant hole in the building. He turns to Toptunov with a look of pure horror. Quietly, he says that they did everything right. He looks down at his hands, and in that moment, he knows they aren't going home. 60 minutes after 0 hour. The fires and emergency lights reveal the full scale of the mess. The reactor building is a hollow, twisted shell of metal and smoke. The men in the control room are now so sick they can barely stand. They are carried out by doctors who don't have the right gear to protect themselves. Sasha Yevchenko, still on site, helps to carry a coworker whose legs have given out. The air tastes like blood now, metallic and thick. Beneath them, the reactor's remains bubble and hiss, a pool of melted fuel chewing through concrete. Hour 2. 2 miles away, plant director Viktor Bryukhanov has been jolted awake. When he reaches the plant, he can't believe his eyes. From a deep underground safety room, Bryukhanov reads reports that make no sense, numbers that shouldn't be possible. He listens to Dyatlov's hurried account, still denying the core's destruction. It can't be true. Bryukhanov orders workers to check the radiation, but the tools they have aren't strong enough to measure levels that high. When the needles hit their highest mark, he dismisses the machines as faulty. Deputy Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin joins Bryukhanov in the bunker looking over the blueprints and schematics. They order more water to be pumped in, hoping that it'll put out the hidden fire. In a call to Moscow, Bryukhanov describes it as a small accident. He promises the fire is being contained and the reactor is safe. Meanwhile, Dyatlov is still arguing with engineers over the readings. Eventually, Dyatlov admits it, at least to himself. It's too late. Outwardly, he just barks orders, his voice cracking. Akimov and Toptunov are moved out by ambulance, their bodies shaking with pain. On the way out, Akimov whispers instructions to the driver, still trying to save a reactor that is already gone. As the sun rises, a massive cloud of smoke and radioactive debris looms over the plant, rising nearly 3 miles into the sky. 6 hours after 0 hour. Helicopters drop bags of sand and clay, pilots risking their lives with every pass. The core's heat melts the materials into a glassy mess, but it buys time. The first cleanup workers arrive with tools, unaware that they have just stepped into a deadly mission. Pripyat is quietly coated with radioactive dust. Children play in it as it drifts down from the sky. Mothers hang laundry outside, and the fabric soaks up radiation. Schools open like normal. Radiation spreads outward, settling over the nearby villages. 12 hours after 0 hour. The sky turns yellow with smoke. More helicopters join the emergency response, dropping chemicals in a desperate attempt to smother the radiation. Plant director Viktor Bryukhanov signs orders to move people out, but delays keep the warning from spreading. Officials fear panic more than the poison. Satellites spot the fire, alerting the West to what's happening. Hour 24. The fires are mostly out, but the core is still simmering underground. Buses roll into Pripyat and loudspeakers announce the evacuation. People are told they'll only be gone for 3 days. Residents pack in minutes, leaving meals on the table, toys on the floor, and doors unlocked. They will never return home. Hour 48. The area surrounding Chernobyl becomes a ghost town under military control. Robots are sent in and they fail within minutes, fried by the radiation. So men in heavy lead suits take their place, working only a few minutes at a time before they have to leave. Beneath the ruined reactor, teams tunnel through the earth and pour concrete, trying to stop the melted core from reaching the groundwater. In the hospitals, the worst stage of the sickness begins. Skin peels away, organs start to fail. 600 miles away in Sweden, a nuclear power plant detects a sudden spike. The wind is already carrying Chernobyl's fallout across Europe. 72 hours after 0 hour. A short update on national TV admits there's been an accident at Chernobyl and claims everything is under control. Above the plant, helicopters fly overhead day and night, dropping more sand and boron, their instruments screaming from the exposure. 10 days after 0 hour. The fires die out on May 6th. Helicopters have dumped more than 5,500 tons of sand, clay, and lead, forming a hard crust over the smoking core. Emissions drop, but small leaks continue seeping into the soil. Cleanup workers continue to be on site, working for a few minutes at a time to stay alive. Alexander Akimov died 15 days after the blast, his body covered in blisters as his organs failed. Leonid Toptunov followed 3 days after that. Anatoly Dyatlov survived the initial blast but lived with radiation sickness for the rest of his life. He was sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp for his role in the disaster. He died in 1995, still blaming the Soviet design, not his own decisions. The immediate death toll was 31. Long-term estimates range from 4,000 to 9,000 cancer deaths, but the damage itself will last for millennia. Hey, this is Josh, and these are the Chernobyl myths everyone still believes, even you. Number 50. People gathered on the Bridge of Death to watch Reactor 4 explode. The Bridge of Death is real. It's 1.2 to 1.9 miles from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. A beam of radioactive light shot into the sky, but the crowd watching the explosion, that never happened. People didn't leave their apartments. They were asleep. Radiation didn't kill any of the 50,000 residents who weren't called to the plant, at least not from immediate acute radiation poisoning. The bridge didn't draw a crowd, but the night had real consequences for some. Number 49. Everyone near Chernobyl died immediately from radiation. The author Svetlana Alexievich, who wrote the book Voices from Chernobyl, interviewed many of the town's residents. They didn't die, but some complained of headaches and a metallic taste in their mouth. That was it. You had to be a lot closer for any of the serious effects, but for the firefighters, it was even worse than most people think. Lyudmila Ignatenko, the wife of the firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, said before her husband died from radiation sickness, she picked up his arm and it was barely anything but bone. Lyudmila said pieces of his lungs, his liver, were coming out of his mouth. He was choking on his internal organs. Not everyone was affected in the same way, and the disaster's scope went deeper than most realized. Number 48. The disaster was unpredictable. The disaster didn't come out of the blue. People tend to think it did, but the Soviets knew that they were taking some very big risks. Reactor operators were stressed all the time. There had already been multiple near misses. So, in 1980, the Soviets ran a secret study on the reactor. They found that there had been, quote, 9 major design failings and thermohydraulic instabilities which undermined the safety. Investigators concluded it wasn't a question of if something would go catastrophically wrong, but when. There was no effort to fix the design flaws. The operators weren't even warned that those flaws could turn them into a zombified mess if disaster struck. Workers didn't know the risks. The risks were known, but information was tightly controlled. Number 47. The Soviets used the 3 Mile Island accident for propaganda. In 1979, the US faced its own nuclear scare at 3 Mile Island. You might think the Soviets would jump on the story for propaganda. They didn't. The news was heavily censored. Officials didn't want anyone thinking the atom was anything other than peaceful and perfectly under control. Authorities in the US were doing something similar, just not full-on censorship. Still, the Soviets didn't let the moment go completely to waste. At the very least, they said the 3 Mile Island accident proved capitalism couldn't run a nuclear power plant. Even as the Soviets stayed quiet, stories about the disaster were spreading beyond their borders. Number 46. Western media portrayed Chernobyl accurately. In 2014, 60 Minutes released a program called Chernobyl, the catastrophe that never ended. An expert writing for the Atomic Insights website said the show was not just a propaganda piece or anti-nuclear, but also anti-Russian. There are many examples of fake or distorted news about Chernobyl from the West. The Soviets did not help themselves by suppressing information. The Russians promised their own version. It was called patriotic, so it might have been distorted. Reports and rumors paint a confusing picture of the human toll. Number 45. Thousands died immediately. Right after the disaster, the United Press International reported that there had been 2,000 deaths. The Pentagon was saying there'd been a second meltdown. Both were untrue. Only 2 people died when the reactor exploded. Another 28 died within 3 months from acute radiation syndrome. In the 10 years that followed, another 11 died. Reports state that cancer rates went up in the contaminated areas. Estimates say maybe 4,000 people would eventually die from it. Others put that number anywhere from 16,000 to 93,000. In other words, no one really agrees on the long-term health effects. Fear rippled far beyond the immediate area, shaping decisions in unexpected ways. Number 44. Radiation caused massive abortions across Europe. It is true that some people began terminating pregnancies, but it was driven by fear. In Denmark, even though radiation levels posed no significant risk to unborn children, there was still an increase in fetal losses. The rate of abortions increased elsewhere: Sweden, Norway, West Germany, even the United Kingdom, and some regions of France saw a rise in fetal terminations. It's estimated there might have been between 100,000 and 200,000 excess abortions all over Europe. Worries about pregnancy were widespread even if the science didn't support it. Number 43. Radiation caused widespread birth defects. There was a widespread fear that children could develop not just early cancer but also birth defects. People imagined effects similar to the small or big heads and malformed eyes seen in Japan after the atomic bombings, or near some of Russia's and the US's nuclear test sites. In a recent paper published in the US National Institutes of Health, scientists wrote that they found, quote, no evidence that radiation exposure from the Chernobyl accident caused genetic changes that were passed on to children. The fallout caused some bizarre stories, including ones about mutants. Number 42. Mutant animals and humans exist. The stories of mutant monsters and feral dogs with canine superpowers aren't exactly true. There is evidence that animals living in the contaminated areas suffered higher rates of tumors and birth defects, but the exclusion zone has become a haven for wildlife. There are said to be 7 times more wolves, but there's also been an increase in the number of lynx, bison, elk, deer, boar, and bears. Despite the rumors, some areas remain surprisingly resilient. Number 41. The exclusion zone is completely uninhabitable. After the disaster, the Soviets created a 19-mile exclusion zone around the power plant. It used to be home to 2 large towns and around 100 villages or farms. Some of the people living there weren't so keen on being told to leave. Like Hanna Zavorotnaya. She hid, but a soldier found her and told her to pack up and leave. She looked at him square in the face and said, "Shoot us and dig the grave, otherwise we're staying." After listening to the soldier explain the dangers, she replied, "Radiation doesn't scare me, starvation does." She was probably right. Life in the danger zone wasn't as scary as we might think. And life in the zone didn't stop entirely, people still went to work. Number 40. All zone workers are in extreme danger. There are about 2,400 to 3,000 workers in what's called the zone of alienation. They work in shifts, tending to the decommissioned reactors and making sure everything stays in order. Most are scientists and technicians, but some are cooks, medics, and a few from the National Guard. They usually go to work by train and return in the evening. But when the Ukraine war started, some had to stay. Honestly, it doesn't look like much fun. Even the animals left behind were part of the story in ways that few expected. Number 39. Stray dogs are radioactive monsters. After the disaster, the Soviets sent in men to kill the pets that had been left behind. Residents had been told they'd be allowed to go back after a few days and collect their dogs. That promise was broken. Some survived by eating garbage and used baby diapers. According to the Dogs of Chernobyl website, there are about 500 strays there today, many of them fed by the workers. They don't have glowing eyes, but some have been exposed to rabies from all the new wild animals. Curiosity attracted outsiders in, even with warnings in place. Number 38. Tourists and explorers are in mortal danger. There used to be a booming tourist industry. You might have thought that running around the exclusion zone would be dangerous. It's not. Well, not really. You could even stay overnight in a hotel located in the town of Chernobyl itself. Or you could go wandering around the contaminated radioactive forests of Belarus. One adventurous explorer found abandoned houses and an old man named Kolya who appeared to live on vodka and breadcrumbs. Want to uncover the shocking truth behind Chernobyl and other catastrophic disasters? Like, share, and subscribe. We have got the astonishing stories of how they really went down. Local culture adapted in creative, sometimes surprising ways. Number 37. Chernobyl vodka is radioactive. Yeah, Chernobyl has its own vodka brand. It was an experimental bottle created by British and Ukrainian scientists using grain grown in the contaminated areas called atomic. It was tested for radiation and was absolutely fine. It was decided that making vodka could become a good way to aid economic recovery for the people whose lives had been upturned. There are hot spots of radiation, but the majority of the areas are fine. The disaster also tested leaders at the very top. Number 36. Gorbachev knew everything and failed. When the disaster happened, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was supposed to be the man who would bring the country closer to the West. So he was furious about there being a cover-up. He apparently shouted at some of the heads of the Soviet nuclear weapons program, "You told us everything was perfectly safe. You assumed we would look up to you as gods." In another angry vent, he said, the entire system consisted of cajolery, boasting, deception, nepotism, and the persecution of dissidents. Even the most powerful man in the Soviet Union was kept in the dark. Decisions made under pressure revealed the true nature of those involved. Number 35. Valery Legasov was a purely selfless hero. Valery Legasov was one of the men assigned to contain the Chernobyl disaster. In the media, he's seen recording a testament about what had gone wrong, and after he was done, he grabbed a rope. It's true the stress got to him. It's also true that he was already sick from radiation. His hair was falling out and his skin had changed to a hue of bronze. It's known as a radiation tan. But he wasn't a selfless hero. He was self-serving as he tried to climb the ranks of the Soviet Union's scientific elites. He'd routinely hosted soirees at his nice house to network with politicians. That said, he was brave enough to write, "The Chernobyl disaster is an apotheosis, the pinnacle of all the mismanagement that has been carried out for decades in our country. The people working on the cleanup weren't always who you might assume." Number 34. Only men worked on cleanup and in hospitals. It's often assumed that people tackling the disaster were male. It's wrong. It's not certain exactly what they did, but the data says out of the 237 patients admitted to hospital number 6 with acute radiation, 2 were women, and their health and well-being were affected in different ways. Number 33. Liquidators survived without health issues. There were about 600,000 liquidators brought in to reduce the radioactive fallout. Many of them were new military recruits. On average, they received 120 times the yearly dose of radiation considered safe. What you don't hear is that they suffered from higher rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, cataracts, and cardiovascular issues. It's believed 13% reported nervous system problems because of all the stress. Studies have shown that many of them didn't recover due to lifelong stress disorders and a heavy use of vodka. Residents experienced the event differently depending on how close they were. Number 32. All nearby residents got radiation sickness. Pripyat resident Pasha Kondratiev said that on the night of the disaster, he, his wife, and their young daughters went to the bridge to see what was happening at the plant. His daughter Tatiana developed asthma, which killed her 7 years later. Was radiation partly to blame? It's hard to say. That's the thing with Chernobyl, no one can agree. Some stories that circulated at the time were more extreme than the truth. Number 31. The Soviet government executed dissenters. One of the biggest myths surrounds the Soviet government executing people for speaking out. These weren't the days of Joseph Stalin. No one was getting shot or thrown out of helicopters for not following orders. The days of summary executions had ended decades earlier. Not every accident was caused by radiation. Number 30. A helicopter crashed due to radiation. In the Chernobyl series, a helicopter flies over the reactor and we're all made to think the radiation somehow makes it fall from the sky. Radiation doesn't do that. Not then, not ever. In real life, a helicopter crashed because its blade struck a chain hanging from a crane. Life outside the reactor carried on, at least for a while. Number 29. Pripyat descended into chaos immediately. Pripyat wasn't a war zone. There were no alarms, no panic. The evacuation didn't come until 36 hours after the reactor exploded. Most people went about their day fishing, playing soccer, washing their underwear, and watching Soviet soap operas on TV. Rumors about the damage spread quickly, sometimes in strange ways. Number 28. Radiation sickness is contagious. Again, because of the TV show and the internet, a lot of people think that you can catch radiation sickness from people who've already been hospitalized. That's not true. Materials can be contaminated, but people are not. You could safely hug a dying fireman even while his flesh was peeling off without getting radiation sickness yourself. The effects of radiation played out over time and not everyone reacted the same way. Number 27. Radiation sickness is quick and simple. It's not. It's brutal, agonizing, and pretty much like a horror movie. One man's face nearly fell off from radiation. He almost became a naked skull. His skin also slid from his arms and legs. The physical toll could be severe, far beyond what most imagined. Number 26. Radiation burns work like fire. When skin and flesh starts peeling away, doctors call it severe moist desquamation. In extreme cases, radiation causes tissue necrosis. It damages DNA inside cells, triggering cell death. The body can't repair itself anymore. Blood vessels collapse, skin breaks down, and the damage spreads deeper into muscles. In other words, it is worse than you can imagine. Returning home might have seemed like a dream. Number 25. Residents could never return home. They were allowed to return home a few months later. The rules were they couldn't reclaim anything big that might gather dust, such as tables or chairs. They couldn't take children's toys either. Even TVs were prohibited. Even in familiar places, things had changed in unexpected ways. Number 24. Pripyat became an instant wasteland. The residents returning found a lot of sour milk. The electricity had, of course, been off for a long time. Natalie Yevchenko took photographs. Some people took valuables like jewelry or antiques, others took tableware or their favorite sheepskin jackets. They only had 4 hours to grab their things. Then it was back to the bus. If they had too much, they were told they couldn't take it. Daily life and routines were suddenly under new rules and controls. Number 23. The Soviets strictly controlled everything after evacuation. The book Midnight in Chernobyl said people did try to pay bribes to get forbidden items out of town. We're not sure if they did, but some second-hand stores suddenly had a lot more inventory. Money was tight, but the evacuees weren't completely abandoned. The Soviet government paid heads of households about 4,000 rubles in compensation, plus extra for each family member. A decent Lada cost around 7,000 to 8,000 rubles at the time. Altogether, donations from across the country were estimated at around 500 million rubles. The lives of the evacuees changed dramatically. Number 22. Evacuees were completely abandoned. A common belief is that the people of Pripyat were ignored. That's not true. Sort of. The government started building houses for many of them. 150 were built about 62 miles from Chernobyl. A total of 11,500 single-family homes were built overall, and another 13,000 apartments across Kyiv and other cities. Outside observers took note of both the efforts and challenges. Number 21. The West only criticized the USSR. Not everything in the West was anti-Soviet. The West applauded the people who built the sarcophagus, the massive shield around the reactor. The builders visited the US and the UK as heroes. 90,000 of them constructed it in 206 days. It wasn't just a feat of engineering, but it was a great risk to their lives. So even as the Cold War raged on, they got respect from the West. And the financial and political costs of the disaster quickly added up. Number 20. Chernobyl alone bankrupted the Soviet Union. Estimates differ, but the disaster might have cost $128 billion at a time when money was tight. There'd be rumors that the CIA caused the accident, and if it had, it certainly helped bring down the Soviet Union 5 years later, but no, the CIA had nothing to do with it. And the most dangerous place became the focus of some of the biggest myths. Number 19. The elephant's foot kills instantly in seconds. It was said that the most radioactive place on Earth was Chernobyl's elephant's foot. The foot was a mixture of molten nuclear fuel, concrete, sand, and steel that melted together during the explosion. The rumor was that if you stood next to it for 30 seconds, you would suffer a guaranteed agonizing death. In 1986, the radiation was so intense that a few minutes could have been lethal. 30 seconds, it wouldn't have been safe, but you would survive. As late as 2016, spending several hours near it could still deliver a fatal dose. And stereotypes were often exaggerated as well. Number 18. Soviet officials drank vodka constantly. It's a common misconception that Soviets in the 80s were constantly downing vodka, including Chernobyl top brass. It's even depicted in the Chernobyl TV show, when Uliana Komayuk stands up to a government official, and of course he has a glass of vodka in his hand. Except drinking vodka openly like that would not have happened. The government was running its anti-alcohol campaign. It worked too, massively reducing death rates and increasing life expectancy. It's highly unlikely that an official would have been openly drinking on the job. In short, getting drunk while at work was a Western stereotype. Even medicine had its limits in confronting what happened. Number 17. Medical treatment saved most victims. The patients were already too far gone. Of the 13 people who received bone marrow transplants, only 2 lived to tell the tale. A nuclear explosion would mean that you would want other countries to know the dangers, right? Information moved slowly, leaving gaps in understanding. Number 16. The USSR immediately informed the world. The Soviet government kept the disaster under wraps. It was Sweden who raised the alarm among the rest of the world. The USSR was still silent when radiation detectors at Sweden's Forsmark nuclear power plant began showing abnormal levels. Despite exposure, not everyone suffered the same consequences. Number 15. Everyone exposed died quickly. That wasn't the case. Some of the most exposed went on to live long lives. Boris Stolyarchuk, the senior control engineer on duty that night, survived. Others in that room didn't. Stolyarchuk got a severe case of radiation syndrome, but in 2018 he was still working in nuclear energy. Even those in charge lived on, though their lives were changed. Number 14. All officials died from radiation exposure. Boris Sherbina was in charge of the commission to investigate the accident. He was never quite right after Chernobyl. He had several heart attacks in his life, and after Chernobyl, he was a fallen man. He died in 1990, age 70. But did he die because of radiation exposure? It's impossible to say. He died of cancer, which obviously can have many causes, but if it was from radiation, no one would have known. The Soviet Ministry of Health signed a secret decree in 1988 that limited when radiation could be listed as a cause of death. Many people endured, living longer than myths would suggest. Number 13. Chernobyl babushkas died quickly from radiation. Older Russians had lived through famines, war, and massacres. A little bit of radiation wasn't going to slow them down. The Samosli, or self-settlers, many of them women called the Chernobyl babushkas, got along fine in the exclusion zone. To them, leaving would have been more dangerous because of all the stress it would bring. One of them said, "If you leave, you die. Those who left are worse off now. They're all dying of sadness." In 1987, the self-settlers numbered around 1,200. In 2021, there were 110. No, not because of danger, they'd all died of old age. The average age in 2021 was 70 to 80. What truly scared residents often wasn't what outsiders assumed. Number 12. Radiation was the biggest fear for residents. One settler was asked what scared her the most. What do you think she answered? Radiation, thieves, rogue soldiers? No, she said snakes and wolves. Anxiety and fear had their own lasting impact. Number 11. Radiation was the main long-term issue. People were so scared of radiation and mutant babies that their anxiety levels went through the roof. The fear was a kind of radiophobia, and it made people stressed. Data showed that cigarette and alcohol consumption of evacuees increased by a massive 40%. That was in line with the rates of depression, PTSD, and anxiety increasing. The fallout affected regions far from the plant, though not always in the ways imagined. Number 10. Fallout made Western Europe dangerous. Sheep in Wales grazed on land that had been rained on by radioactive clouds. Like everyone else, the Welsh didn't know after the disaster just how much they might be affected. Everyone was scared. In the end, it affected their pockets more than their bodies. Farmers couldn't sell their lamb or beef at the markets. 344 Welsh farms were put under restrictions. A 40-pound animal was suddenly going for 10 to 12 pounds at the market. But in truth, those sheep or their meat wasn't dangerous to people. Reports of mutations were often exaggerated or misunderstood. Number 9. Mutant animals appeared across Europe. According to one farmer, more abnormal lambs were being born than usual. He might have been paranoid, though. No studies exist that say he was right. People's reactions ranged from cautious to extreme. Number 8. People reacted rationally to the disaster. At the time, there was a massive surge of paranoia around the world. In many places, people stopped drinking milk. Parents poured it down the sink as if the cows had started glowing in the dark. Vegetables went unsold in markets in some countries. Children were told not to sit on the grass or play in the sandboxes because the rain might have sprinkled them with fallout. It was good old fear and misinformation carried not by social media, but by tabloid news and rumors. Some tasks at the plant were physically intense, but not in the ways rumors suggested. Number 7. Chernobyl miners worked naked. Miners had to dig a hole under the reactor pad to stop all the radiation-infused lava from reaching the water table and potentially killing half of Europe. And they sweated a lot and lost a couple of items of clothing, but they never got naked. Anyway, the lava never made it that far, so their job wasn't even necessary. It wasn't just one person's actions that caused the disaster. Number 6. A few incompetent operators caused the disaster. Except that's not true. People inside the Soviet nuclear system already knew there were dangers. Safety procedures were sometimes ignored. But the deeper problem was the reactor itself and the way the entire system was run. The reactor design had serious flaws. Warnings had been overlooked, but the culture of secrecy meant problems weren't openly discussed. In other words, the disaster wasn't just the fault of a few men in a control room, it was the result of the entire system. Some stories focused on the most personal tragedies, but they weren't always accurate. Number 5. A baby absorbed radiation to save its mother. Firefighter Vasily Ignatenko died one of the worst kinds of deaths imaginable, but his wife Lyudmila was pregnant at the time. Was she endangering her unborn child by being around her dissolving husband? Her baby died from congenital heart defects and liver cirrhosis a few hours after it was born. It was rumored that she'd caught radiation poisoning from Vasily. That's not true at all. Vasily wasn't radioactive in the hospital. Lyudmila might have gotten close to radiation at some other point in time, and there's no way a fetus could save its mother in an act of undeliberate self-sacrifice. The firefighters faced unimaginable situations, testing both courage and rules. Number 4. Firefighters had no idea of the danger. They weren't completely ignorant, as you might have heard. One of them, Anatoly Zakharov, had told his coworker, "There must be an incredible amount of radiation here. We'll be lucky if we're still alive in the morning." Still, they didn't know the reactor was on fire. They thought it was a regular fire. Some made the mistake of going to the roof to pour water from their hoses down on the reactor, and they got hit by so much radiation that one man's eyes turned from brown to blue in the hospital. Another had radiation burns that formed blisters on his heart. But unlike the common thread, they knew the danger. Zakharov said, "Of course we knew. If we'd followed regulations, we would never have gone near the reactor, but it was a moral obligation, our duty. We were like kamikaze." Some consequences were immediate, while others developed over time. Number 3. Radiation burns instantly on contact. Alexander Yevchenko was the man who held the door for his 3 colleagues who made the fatal mistake of entering the reactor hall. But Yevchenko didn't suffer instant burns to his flesh. Radiation isn't like fire. After the initial vomiting, his hair fell out, his skin had ugly blisters, everything hurt, then he started turning black. He said he felt like a monster. Luckily, his body accepted the skin graft. Blood transfusions and blood vessel transplants did the rest. As other men died, he lived, and he didn't know why. They'd go blind, then their blood became infected, things fell off, and their bed was empty. That is the thing not generally understood. Everyone reacts differently, and for some, their body can't take it more than others. Reactions to exposure varied widely, and the aftermath affected lives in unexpected ways. Number 2. Survivors remained radioactive threats. Because of the pandemic of paranoia, when Alexander Yevchenko recovered enough to live a normal life, people would see him in the street and cross to the other side. They thought he was radioactive. Like the A-bomb survivors in Japan, it was like the victims of Chernobyl had the plague. Alexander was awarded medals for bravery, yet treated like a monster. He said the radiophobia made his life very difficult. Even the people at the front lines weren't always in the situation that they were portrayed to be. Number 1. The divers sacrificed themselves and died immediately. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. These were the men who had to go on a mission that they knew they might not come back from. They had to wade through the water they thought was highly contaminated and turn on the valves to prevent another explosion. There are some lies, though. They didn't bravely volunteer to go. They were ordered to do their job. It was their shift. No drama, no arguments, and it turned out their mission wasn't as dangerous as they first thought. Millions of dead across Europe? No. Even if there had been another explosion, there might have been a few dozen more deaths in Ukraine and Belarus. But it would not have been world-changing. And they didn't all die right after. Boris Baranov died of a heart attack in 2005, but the others are still alive today. There's a rumor circulating on Reddit that Ananenko's apartment complex was hit by a Russian Shahed drone during the war. We can't confirm this, but he definitely moved out of Kyiv because it was dangerous. Hour 0. April 25, 1986, Chernobyl power plant, located about 2 miles from Pripyat, a small town in northern Ukraine. At just before midnight, the engineer-mechanic Alexander Yuvchenko clocks in for his night shift, a shift that will go down on record as one of the most controversial few hours in history, creating a panic that will take over the planet. The mood among the workers is joyful. It's a beautiful night after a sunny day, and the May Day holiday is just around the corner. At home, sleeping in his small apartment, is his wife, Natasha, and his 2-year-old son, Kirill. The family is well taken care of, and although Natasha has some misgivings about the safety of nuclear power, only recently those fears were diminished when she heard a Soviet official on TV saying nuclear meltdowns just don't happen, or if they do, he said, they might be one every 10,000 years. In just over 24 hours from now, people who Natasha knows will be out on the street looking into the sky at a dazzling laser beam shooting into the stars. At exactly the same time, her husband will be in a party of 4 men who were exposed to deadly amounts of radiation after being sent to assess the damage at Chernobyl's reactor number 4. 3 of them will die in excruciating pain, their bodies destroyed from within. Alexander will survive because he doesn't enter the reactor hall, but only holds a door for his friends. The arm and leg and shoulder that he uses will later turn black. He'll tell Natasha, with what he thinks could be his dying words, that he's been turned into a mutant. Alexander will see things the communist government will want to keep secret. Death by radiation is a monstrous thing to behold, and the Chernobyl power plant disaster will be one of the most monstrous events in world history. At the heart of the matter is a design flaw that the Soviets will not want to admit. What the capitalists can do, they can do just as well, or so they think. One thing you don't want at a nuclear power station is a total shutdown. If that happens, things can heat up, and if an explosion follows, what you have is a massive leakage of deadly radiation. So every reactor at Chernobyl has 3 backup diesel generators that will kick in if power is suddenly lost. The problem is, it takes 60 to 75 seconds for them to fully power the coolant pumps. The theory, and it's only a theory, is that the slowing turbines after being turned off will create enough electrical power to keep the pumps running during that gap, before the generators are running at capacity. To know if this works, they need to do some tests. The first came in 1982 and it wasn't successful. They tried again in 84, and again the results were not good. Then they tried in 85, and yet again a message was sent back to Moscow saying things hadn't gone as planned. Hour 1. Now you know the night shift isn't properly prepared for the test, and it might be their fault that the power out of the plant falls too much at 28 minutes past midnight on April 26th. They try to increase power, but something's wrong. They've never seen this before. This is partly because there's been a buildup of xenon during the test. You don't need to know what xenon is, and to be frank, it's too complicated to fully explain, but when there's a buildup of the stuff, it can cause xenon poisoning. Xenon would usually burn away when the reactor is at full power, but the slowdown has caused a buildup, and the buildup has caused a further slowdown. This is not good. It's because of this overabundance of xenon that even when the guys take most of the control rods out, 200 from 206, they still can't get enough power. As you know, by taking out the rods, they should get more power since the nuclear reaction isn't hampered. Doing this, though, can be pretty dangerous. In fact, they shouldn't be doing this in the first place. A young operator gets on the phone and asks, "What shall I do?" In the program, there are instructions of what to do, and then a lot of things are crossed out. The guy on the other end pauses and says, "Follow the crossed out instructions." Hour 2. At around 1:05 a.m. they have power stabilized, although the reactor is running well below what the shift supervisor, Anatoly Dyatlov, thinks is ideal. One day he'll lie and say he wasn't in the room when mistakes were made, but he was. Don't forget his name. The reactor is certainly running at less power than is safe for a test, but they carry on anyway on the orders of Dyatlov. He doesn't want a black mark against his name in the form of another failed test. At 1:24 and 4 seconds, the test really starts, meaning they're going to simulate a power outage and, as we have explained, see if the slowing turbines can power the coolant pumps before the generators can turn on. This is when all hell breaks loose. What happens is a sudden and massive increase in power. It is dangerously high, and this is now very serious. So serious that someone hits the scram button. At Chernobyl, this was the AZ5 button. It's an emergency off switch, which makes all the control rods drop down to stop the nuclear reactions. This is a big mistake, and one which exposes a few of the design flaws at Chernobyl. The rods have a graphite tip, which in short actually increases the reaction rate, not the opposite as wanted. The boron in the rods reduces reactivity, but not the tips. As so many rods hit the reactor at the same time, there's a huge surge in reactivity. The operators don't know what they've done. The graphite tips are fixed in position, and the heat creates a massive amount of hot steam, in effect, a bomb. The operators are not aware of this, or they wouldn't have dropped the rods into the reactor already surging with power. The man in the reactor hall watches as this happens and is shocked to see those 200 rods and their caps, each weighing 772 pounds, jumping up and down with the reactor lid. It's as if they're being pushed by the power of God. The output of the reactor is now at 10 times the power it should be, and that's it. Bang! The bomb goes off. The world will never be the same again after this moment. The explosion causes the reactor's steel lid, weighing about 10,000 tons or 2,000 medium-sized male African elephants, to fly off and go straight through the roof. Shortly after, there's another big explosion, likely down to a buildup of hydrogen from zirconium steel reactions. Bits of radioactive material and fuel are sent everywhere. Fires rage and the core is exposed to the world. Right now, it's not obvious to most of the men in the plant what's happening. They all think the reactor is still intact, only because reactors normally don't just blow up. The roof is destroyed, the floor is in pieces, radioactive materials are lying about everywhere. The air is filled with clouds of dust, pieces of radioactive graphite are flung great distances, and radiation is now spilling into the atmosphere. To say this is bad would be putting it lightly. Soon a few men will know this, but one that knows it best will be too dead to tell the story. Right now, Alexander is in a state of shock. Just a moment ago, he was in his office with some colleagues reading some documents, but now everything around them is shuddering on the brink of what feels like imminent collapse. His first thought is, this is war. The USA has attacked us. He's not alone in thinking this. What else could have happened? The phone rings. It's the guys from building number 3. Bring some stretchers, they shout over the noise. Alexander takes off down some dark corridors in search of the men he knows are the closest to the explosion site. As he gets closer to a deafening hissing sound, he finds his buddy. His face is horribly disfigured, so much so that he knows only who it is when he hears the sound of his voice. More people are injured, the guy tells Alexander. He then meets with Yuri Trigup, who's come from control room number 4. He tells Alexander that Dyatlov has asked for the emergency high-pressure coolant water to flood the area. Dyatlov still doesn't know that the reactor has blown, and he won't even believe it when he's told. Now waist-deep in water, Alexander and a few other men try to get to the coolant taps, but through the door they see the giant water containers have been blown apart. All the men are terrified. This is worse than they thought. Alexander looks around at what's left of the room and sees his colleague Kodyemchuk on the floor, dead. He then looks up at the roof, or where the roof was, and he sees something magical, a great beam of light reaching to the heavens. It's magnificent and beautiful. And as things now stand, Alexander is not aware of how deadly it is. For a few seconds, he just stares at what he doesn't know are gamma rays and neutrons. A more experienced colleague who knows what it is grabs him by the shoulder and pulls him away, likely saving his life doing so. Alexander sets off to the control room number 4, and there he meets the other guys who've been ordered by Dyatlov to go to the reactor hall and lower the control rods by hand. This is madness, sheer madness. Alexander screams, there is no reactor hall. The reactor has blown up. There are no control rods. They've blown up too. There's nothing left but space. The guys think he's crazy. Reactors don't explode. Alexander has to admit what he's seen. He's only seen from the bottom floor. The men tell him he needs to assess the damage from above to really know what's happened. The 4 of them head to the reactor hall upper floor. Little do they know this is a journey to the end of the night, for 3 of them anyway. As you know, Alexander only survives because he's the one that holds the door, being the strongest of the 4. When the guys come out, they say nothing can be done. They look at Alexander and tell him he's right. They say the reactor hall now looks like a volcano crater. They understand that radiation levels are high. Of course they do, it's their job. But they don't know just how high. They look at the radiation level reader device they have, the dosimeter, and that needle is off the scales. But they still don't know how bad they are because what is happening is so unprecedented. It's still only just after 1:55, but the firefighters are already outside on the scene. They too don't have much of an idea of the gravity of the situation. and they start and try to put out some of the fires that have started in various places. They're not even wearing protective clothing. Some of them will die in agony very soon. Others will pass away in a month, their immune systems destroyed by the radiation. Back in Pripyat, most people are in bed asleep, although a few are now standing outside, mesmerized by the ethereal beam in the sky they don't know is caused by irradiated air. They just think it looks cool. In the years to come, stories told in the West will say there was a large group of them on a bridge, watching radioactive blue dust fall like snowflakes. This will be called the Bridge of Death. The stories will say they all died, but none of that is true. There was no Bridge of Death. Most people were asleep at the time. In the end, most people who were close to the accident recovered, with just 20% of those who suffered acute radiation poisoning biting the dust. As you'll see again in this show, it sometimes pays not to believe everything you see on TV or in the newspapers. If you don't know, the way radiation poisoning works on the body is it takes out electrons from atoms in a person's molecules, destroying the chemical bonds and thus damaging tissue. We don't need to tell you that this is not good for the person. In short, after an hour or two, diarrhea and vomiting can occur as tissue in the GI tract breaks down and bacteria is let loose on the body. Bone marrow stops producing white blood cells and infections can't be fought. Since the person's immune system is incredibly weak, without an immune system, your countless bacteria eat you from within. This might take some time, so even though the person is covered in blisters and ulcers, they could start to feel okay after a couple days. But then a blood infection might lead to a deadly sepsis. For some at Chernobyl, even a blood transfusion and bone marrow transplant won't help them. One of the townspeople is Lyudmila Ignatenko. She's already awake and has seen the glow. Her husband Vasily is currently fighting the fires. The two are due to have a child in 2 months. Fast forward a week and his skin is covered in boils, and when he turns on his pillow, he leaves skin and hair behind. The lesions spread out and some of his skin now looks like a white film. At one point he asks Lyudmila for a mirror, but when he sees his own disfigured face, he cries out in horror. Vasily will be buried in a zinc casket under cement, his body still radioactive. Lyudmila is lucky she even got to see him. A nurse told her it was too dangerous. She looked at Lyudmila and warned, "If you start crying, I'll kick you out right away. No hugging or kissing, don't even get near him. You have half an hour." Lyudmila will have much to say about this in time to come. She'll also lose the child. It'll be born with a congenital heart defect and liver cirrhosis and will die after a few hours. Many people will criticize her for this, asking why she visited her dying husband. The radiation from him contaminated her and the fetus, they'll say. But you can't just catch radiation from a cleaned person, and there's no proof this is how the baby died. A falsity that will be talked about for years is the baby somehow took the radiation and that saved her. This is not scientific at all, but it makes a good newspaper copy and great TV. The consequences of this misinformation will mean the lives and lights of hundreds of thousands of babies are put out before they get going. We should say, though, that while seeing her dying husband wasn't the reason for the baby dying, it was very likely radiation exposure from somewhere else that led to the death. Back in 1986, the nurse that told Lyudmila not to touch her husband couldn't have known radiation doesn't spread to people after they've been cleaned and are out of their contaminated clothes. It's not contagious. We should also tell you that a person's hand can't suddenly burn when they touch the hand of a contaminated person. That's TV, not reality. One of the firefighters turns to his friend and jokes, saying, "There must be an incredible amount of radiation here. We'll be lucky if we are all still alive in the morning." As the survivors will later testify, they were never told the reactor was on fire, only that there were regular fires to put out. Some of them kicked the radioactive blocks, even picking them up with their hands after they doused them. They would have never done those things had they known the truth. One of the firefighters who survived explained how little they knew, saying some of his colleagues went up to the roof to work from there. Soberingly, he said, "Then those boys who died went up to the roof. Vashchik, Kolya, and others. Volodya Pravik, they went up to the ladder and I never saw them again." Hour 3. Local officials have already arrived on the scene to discuss what's happening. When they're told, they're not told the entire truth. That's because only a handful of people right now truly understand that the reactor has blown up, and some of them are now burned, vomiting, so not in a meeting explaining what they've seen. Dialov still thinks what he always has, that a water tank is blown up and the radiation currently making some people very sick is from contaminated water. He just can't believe that the core would blow, even though some people are starting to realize that a water tank blowing up wouldn't lead to so much destruction. Hour 4. More firemen arrive to help with the fires. The last thing anyone wants is Reactor 3 to set on fire, which is looking like a possibility. It's soon safely shut down, but Reactors 1 and 2 keep going until the next day. Inside Reactor 4 is now a molten reactor core, a large graphite and concrete slag that's burning at around 1200 degrees Celsius. The military will help with the cleanup, and many men will be expected to risk their lives.
These people will become known as the liquidators, and many of them will suffer long-term health effects from their work. Hour 33. Sherbina gets on the phone with Moscow and reports, "We've measured the radiation. Pripyat needs to be evacuated immediately. The station is close by and it's emitting radioactive contagion, and people in the city are living it up full blast. Weddings are going on." Levels of radioactivity in the town are rising at an alarming rate. Earlier in the day, the level was between 14 and 140 milliroentgens per hour, but that's gone up to 180 to 300 milliroentgens, and in areas closer to the plant, 600. 50 milliroentgens or more per year can be dangerous, with 400 milliroentgens per year killing you. The people in that town now have a much higher risk of developing cancer, and they have no idea about it. Still, in parts of the plant, the level has reached an astounding 20,000 milliroentgens per hour, and that's why some men died so soon after exposure. Hour 36. Sometime in the morning, the first helicopters start dropping the sand and boron on the fire. It's a perilous job. Getting too close to the hole where the reactor was can lead to acute radiation sickness. It's dangerous enough anyway, as can be seen when one helicopter collides with a chain and crashes, killing the men on board. Hour 38. The evacuation begins. From speakers all over the town comes a woman's voice, saying the same thing over and over again. "Attention, attention. In connection with the accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city of Pripyat. In order to ensure complete safety for residents, children first and foremost, it has become necessary to carry out a temporary evacuation." They're told to take everything with them that's important, including all their personal documents. They don't know it, but they're never going back to their homes. Just 1 hour before this announcement, families were enjoying the weekend. In the cafeteria, in the shopping mall, kids and their mothers were hanging out and eating ice cream. For them, it was just a normal day. There were kids playing on the bumper cars. Then suddenly, they were told the ride was over. Now they're taken aback when they hear the speakers say, "Comrades, on leaving your dwellings, please do not forget to close windows, switch off electrical and gas appliances, and turn off water taps. Please remain calm, organized, and orderly." What's startling is these people have not been told the full story and certainly aren't given any protective clothing. In spite of the fact that Soviet officials know about the dangerous levels of radiation, so far they don't want to cause too much panic, or for the word to get out about the disaster. Hour 42. Sherbina calls Premier Nikolai Ryshkov and explains there are no people left in Pripyat. There are only dogs running around. What happens to the mutts in the end is awful, but that's a few days away yet. Sherbina's not exactly correct about all the people leaving. Some young folks have hidden so they can stay together in their parents' apartments and get it on for once with some privacy. They don't care much about some little radiation leak. Old folks too have stayed behind, or some of them have. They're well past the age of moving away, and they're too tough to worry about radiation. Some have lived well through wars, famine, and Stalin's reign of terror. Hour 46. 116,000 people have left, about 1,200 have stayed behind, mostly the aged and many of them women, babushkas as they say in Russian. They have refused to budge, but it's hard to argue with a stubborn babushka. One woman, Hanna Zavorotnya, is given a stern order to leave after she's been found by a soldier. She looks him square in the face and says, "Shoot us and dig the grave, otherwise we're staying." After listening to the soldier explain the danger, she replies, "Radiation doesn't scare me, starvation does." The world still doesn't know the extent of what's happened, and you can be sure the Soviet leaders are determined to try to keep matters within a fairly small circle. The KGB is told to stop the spread of panicky rumors and unreliable information getting out, although nothing they can do to prevent what happens next. Hour 52. The Soviets get word that Sweden has detected radiation, and it has been identified as coming from Chernobyl. On top of this, soon the USA will have satellite photos of the disaster. The news carries as fast as the radiation, with presenters all over the world telling people that this major accident, something that's never happened before on this scale, could mean dangerous radiation being carried from Ukraine to other European cities. As the children of Chernobyl settle into their new surroundings, school kids in Germany are kept home in fear of radiation poisoning. Panic reverberates from North America back to Europe and into Asia. Hour 55. It's not until the evening that the official news is shown on Russian TV. A report states there's been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the nuclear reactors was damaged. The effects of the accident are being remedied. Assistance has been provided for any affected people. An investigative commission has been set up. More Russian news follows, and this time with in-depth discussions. Not surprisingly, experts talk about the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident of the USA and some other American nuclear mishaps. What the news doesn't talk about is what could happen at Chernobyl right now. A new kind of disaster could be in the works. Hour 58. It was thought the water tanks were empty, which isn't actually the case. To make things worse, fire hoses have been filling the place with more water. Soviet scientists are now saying that if the smoldering graphite, remember heated to about 1200 degrees Celsius, hits the water, there could be another massive explosion, even bigger than the last one. And that could mean Europe being hit with more radiation. They don't know it yet, but it's highly unlikely this explosion will happen. They think it could, and so tell 3 men who know the area inside and out that they'll have to drain the 20,000 tons of water through a sluice gate. These men know that there's a good chance they might not make it out, and even if they do, they might not live very long after. Hence the name the Chernobyl Suicide Squad. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespolov, and Boris Baranov. Hour 60. Finding the valves in the dark is like finding a needle in a haystack, but they do it in the end. For them, it's just another day at work. They knew they'd be fired if they didn't do as asked, and unlike what will be said in years to come, they didn't get any reward for their work. As we've explained, there will be a lot of Western misinformation flying about in regard to the Chernobyl disaster. One falsity told time and again is that these 3 men all died shortly after they succeeded in their mission. But they didn't. They lived long, healthy lives after their time in the darkness of Chernobyl. Hour 66. The Soviet government is now worried that the molten core will burn through the cement and get to the groundwater, thereby contaminating it and spreading radiation to the rest of Ukraine and into Europe, possibly making some places uninhabitable. A mining team is brought in to dig a huge tunnel below the reactor to act as a cooling system, and they're given respirators for the work, but it's hard to breathe with them on. It's also very hot, but they don't work naked, as will be told in TV in the future. Again, it's a big job and a risky job for the 400 or so miners. The Soviets don't have to be too concerned because the core won't melt through the concrete. Obviously, they don't know that yet and have to take all precautions. Hour 100. The debris removal starts. At first, the 100 tons of radioactive material is said to be so dangerous that the men shouldn't go near it. They opt to use robots, but most of the robots break as soon as deployed due to radiation. The liquidators are chosen to do the job, men who are now camping close to the plant. Thousands of them are there, and in time, 600,000 or so of them will help with the cleanup. They're given protective clothing, but still told they shouldn't stay on the roof longer than 40 to 90 seconds, since the graphite and other materials up there are about as radioactive as you can get. Of the 5,000 men who do the job, some will go up as many as 6 times, but it's hard to say how many will have health problems because of it. Alexander, as you know, survives. He's flown to Moscow, his hair falls out and he finds it hard to breathe. His eyes, nose, and most of his face hurts. But then after a couple days, he and the other men all start to feel pretty good. As you already know, this doesn't mean they are good. One day, he's in pain again and he pulls back his bedsheets to see massive ulcers and necrotic skin on his shoulder, hip, and calf. All the bits exposed when he held the door open. He's turning black and feels like he's a monster, telling himself he looks like some kind of radioactive mutant. Luckily for him, his body accepts the skin grafts, and blood transfusions and bone marrow transplants do the rest. His arm is in really bad shape and will stay in bandages for years. In the hospital, every so often, someone walks into the room and tells him another of his colleagues is dead. One of them first goes blind, and then the infection in his blood finishes him off. For 2 months, Alexander lies in bed close to death, thinking about how it'll be when it's his turn to die. He will later be awarded medals for his bravery, but once he's better, he'll keep his Chernobyl experience mostly to himself. For many years to come, people in this part of the world will cross the street if they see a Chernobyl survivor walking toward them. These people, not educated about radiation, wrongly assume the survivors are contaminated. This fear has devastating consequences. Soon after the disaster, there are 150,000 elective abortions. Chernobyl, in fact, will make much of the world wrongly overestimate the dangers of producing nuclear power. This will go on for decades and is still a factor in some people's minds today when they think about nuclear energy. What or who is to blame for the disaster is the question that the Soviets and many other countries will be asking for some time to come. The investigations at the start will mostly blame human error rather than technical error, and pick out a few names to shame and send to prison, such as Mr. Dyatlov. Sure, he messed up a bit, as did others at the plant, but the fault lies in many people, going right up to the top brass in the communist government. 1 year later. It's now 1987, and Legasov is very ill from radiation poisoning and is in and out of the hospital all the time. He knows he's going to die, so he records himself on tape telling the whole truth about how and why this disaster happened. Part of the tape goes, "The Chernobyl disaster is an apotheosis, the pinnacle of all the mismanagement that has been carried out for decades in our country. When one looks at the chain of events, why someone acted in this way and another in that way and so on, it's impossible to point to a single culprit, an initiator of all the unpleasant events that led to the crime, because it's a chain that links to itself." He finishes off by warning that as he speaks, the Soviet Union does not have a safe nuclear power plant. not because of the production of energy is dangerous in itself, but because too many mistakes have been made and too many corners have been cut. He says when you can't hold the state accountable, then the state is broken. 2 years later. In 1988, the day after the second anniversary of the accident, he is found dead in his apartment. Sherbina, who'd become a close friend, said Valery was too great. I loved him more than all the people I knew. He gave all of himself to work, to Chernobyl. He burnt out. Of 237 people that suffered acute radiation sickness, 31 died within a couple of months. The amount of people that died from cancer due to radiation poisoning reached around 4,000, and many more survived cancer. Still, the health effects of the disaster have been argued about for many years. As for Reactor 4, it was covered with a giant steel and concrete building called the sarcophagus containment structure. An exclusion zone was formed covering an area of around 1,000 square miles of Ukraine. Over the years, the town of Pripyat became home to life again, but the wild animal kind, not the human kind. 20 years later. After all those pet dogs and cats, they were killed by special teams, not long after the disaster became worldwide knowledge. Some may have survived though, because in the years to come, dogs in the town will be seen alongside wolves, brown bears, deer, badgers, lynx, bison, and moose. In 20,000 years, the town of Pripyat might be safe again for humans to go and live there. You can visit now, but experts recommend you don't eat the wild mushrooms or other plants you can find there, and wear something you're prepared to throw away later. Radiation sucks, but we can't live without it. April 26, 1986, 1:23:04 a.m. Technicians in the control room at Chernobyl nuclear power plant sit at their stations. The concrete room is cool, the air damp. Initiating safety test now, one of the operators says. The fuel rods begin to shift in nuclear reactor unit 4. Suddenly, there is a power surge in the core. A siren begins to blare in the control room. Red lights flash, casting a blood-red glow across the faces of the men in the chamber. An uncontrollable chain reaction is initiated in the nuclear reactor. One of the operators sprints over to a control panel and slams his fist against the emergency shutdown button. The control rods jam as they proceed toward the core. 54 seconds after the test is initiated, there is an explosion. In 1977, Soviet engineers and workers constructed 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site that would become the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. After the disaster, this facility would simply be known as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. By the following year, one of the reactors would be brought online, and in 1984, the plant would have 4 active reactors, with a 5th under construction. Each of the reactors was capable of producing around 1,000 megawatts of electric power. Chernobyl sits just south of the Belarus border in Ukraine and is about 65 miles or 104 kilometers north of Kyiv. On April 25, 1986, at 1 in the morning, the operators at Chernobyl reduced the power being sent to reactor number 4 as they prepared to run a safety test on the system. This was done at the same time that routine maintenance was being carried out. The test itself would determine if the still spinning turbines of the reactor could continue to produce enough electricity to keep the coolant pumps operating if there was ever a complete loss of power at the plant. This information needed to be ascertained in order to surmise whether the gap between a power loss and the time it took for the emergency generators to kick in would result in a nuclear meltdown or catastrophic failure. At 2 p.m. that day, the cooling system was disabled, so the test could be run without any interference. The tampering with the coolant system was not disclosed to some of the incoming operators during the shift change, which would have been information needed in the moments before the core went critical. As the day progressed, the test was pushed further and further back to make sure it did not interfere with the power needs of the surrounding towns. Reactor 4's power levels were kept around 1,600 megawatts while the team waited for the appropriate time to start the experiment. At 11:10 p.m., operators at Chernobyl received word that they could continue the experiment. However, the shift change was about to happen, so rather than starting the test in the middle of a shift change, the shutdown was delayed once again. At midnight, the new shift came in. They were less experienced and had not been properly briefed or trained on what should be done during the test. This would lead to catastrophic mistakes in the hours to come. Just after midnight, the power of reactor number 4 was lowered to 720 megawatts. The reactor was not designed to go below 700 megawatts for a sustained period of time. But for some reason, most likely due to poor oversight and training, the night shift operators at Chernobyl were unaware of this safety measure. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26, the reactor reached 500 megawatts. The local control system switched over to the automatic regulating system as energy output became dangerously low. In order to remedy the situation, the operators scrambled to remove many of the control rods in the reactor, which directly violated the safety guidelines at the power plant. This decision did not have the desired effect. A buildup of xenon on the core caused the power levels to drop even further. Either due to human error or a malfunction in the system, the reactor's output fell to 30 megawatts. By 1 a.m., the team had managed to raise the power output of the reactor number 4 to 200 megawatts. This was still below prescribed levels, but it seemed as if the core had stabilized for the moment. The deputy chief engineer and acting supervisor at Chernobyl, Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, decided that the test could recommence. In preparation for what was to come, he ordered the automatic emergency shutdown system and power regulating system to be turned off. Water flow was increased to the core, while additional cooling pumps were activated. This decreased the heat in the system and led to low reactivity, which necessitated the need to remove more control rods so the reactor could continue to run at 7% power for the next several minutes. Due to a buildup of pressure in a steam drum, the order was given to increase feed water flow into the core. This further reduced the number of nuclear reactions occurring in the system and caused automated safety measures to kick in and remove several more control rods. The operators and engineers conducting the experiment continually ran into pressure and reactivity issues for several more minutes. However, around 1:23 a.m., all systems seemed to finally stabilize. Dyatlov ordered the commencement of the test. At 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 began to run as planned. This process would take about 30 seconds. At 1:23 a.m., pressure began to build in the core once again. A series of warning lights started to flash. One of the operators initiated an emergency shutdown, but several control rods jammed as they entered the core. An out-of-control chain reaction began in the reactor. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, the chain reaction reached critical levels, and there was an explosion in reactor number 4. This was immediately followed by a second explosion that blew the 1,000-ton roof off the structure and shot a fireball into the sky, briefly illuminating the surrounding area as if it were the middle of the day. The explosion in reactor number 4 caused a massive disruption in energy output. Power fluctuated throughout the power plant. The explosion ejected hundreds of tons of irradiated dust into the air as chunks of radioactive graphite hurtled across the area. Radiation began to spew out of the exposed reactor like smoke rising from a volcano. The entire complex rocked from the explosions, but the operators in the control center continued to operate as if reactor number 4 was still intact. Several engineers insisted that there had been a catastrophic failure and that all evidence pointed to a partial meltdown in the core. However, the initial reaction of Anatoly Dyatlov was to continue operating the nuclear power plant as if nothing was wrong, even though one of the reactors had just exploded and was releasing radiation and debris into the atmosphere. This led to slow response times from the personnel working in the control room, while emergency crews who could see the explosion from miles away began rushing to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to get the flames under control. At least 28 people were killed in the initial explosion, and 100 more were seriously injured out of the 600 workers present at the power plant that night. 134 of them, including the operators running the test gone wrong, received between 0.8 and 16 grays of radiation, or about 80 to 1600 rads. This high dose of radiation resulted in all of them developing radiation sickness soon after the accident. 28 died within 3 months of the reactor exploding. At 1:28 a.m., the first firefighters arrived at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The facility was being consumed by several fires raging across the complex. Other than personnel trying to escape the flames, these firefighters were the first people exposed to the lethal doses of radiation pouring out of the exposed reactor after the initial explosion. They had not been warned of the dangers they were walking into. The firefighters did not wear any protective clothing, nor take any precautions to mitigate their exposure to radiation as they rushed into the nuclear power plant, trying to save as many lives as they could. At 2:15 a.m., almost an hour after the reactor blew up, local Soviet officials were briefed on the compromised nuclear power plant. They decided to set up roadblocks along the main entry points into and out of the nearby city of Pripyat, which had been built to house the Chernobyl workers and their families. Even though the local officials knew that a catastrophic event had happened, They were not given information on the extent of the damage, the danger the exposed core presented, or that the population in the surrounding area should be evacuated. Therefore, all personnel assisting with the roadblocks, including police and military officers, had not been warned about the true extent of the dangers the power plant posed. Like the firefighters who were on the front lines, these first responders proceeded closer to the Chernobyl power plant without any protective gear. For the remainder of the night into the early morning, emergency personnel continued to provide any form of aid they could, exposing themselves to high doses of radiation. The fire in Reactor number 4 continued to rage. In order to increase safety measures and to make sure no further reactor failures occurred, officials ordered that Reactor number 3 be shut down at 5 a.m. and Reactors 1 and 2 be shut down a few hours later. However, all 3 remaining reactors would be reopened in the coming months, even as the true nature of the disaster was discovered by the rest of the world. The last of the fires that had spread through the complex were finally extinguished at 6:35 a.m. However, the inferno burning in the core of Reactor 4 was unreachable without emergency personnel receiving deadly doses of radiation. Emergency personnel had already been in the building to put out fires and rescue any survivors, and anyone who stepped foot near the exposed reactor core would die of radiation poisoning in the coming months. This posed a significant problem for Soviet leadership. Nuclear engineers and scientists from across the Soviet Union who were consulted about the Chernobyl disaster warned the leadership that as long as the core was exposed and the fire continued to burn in its core, more and more radioactive material would be spewed into the air and sweep across the region. The Soviet Union wanted to keep the extent of the Chernobyl disaster quiet for as long as possible, and therefore suppressed information going into and coming out of the area. However, they needed to get the fire in the core under control, or eventually the radiation levels would be so high that there would be no hiding what had happened. At 10 a.m. on April 27th, the Soviets began flying transport helicopters loaded with sand, boron, lead, and dolomite over the exposed core of Reactor number 4. These substances were dropped into the core to suppress the fire and contain some of the radiation. The residents in and around Chernobyl continued to be left in the dark about what was happening at the nuclear power plant. Emergency personnel who had been at the plant and returned home informed their loved ones of how bad things were. The tragic part was that these men didn't just bring home stories. Since no one was ordered to wear protective gear, anyone who was at the power plant was covered in radiation, which they brought home with them, exposing their family and loved ones to the deadly particles that clung to their clothes, skin, and hair. At 2 p.m. on April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion at the nuclear power plant, Soviet officials began evacuating people from the area. They had known how deadly the spreading radiation was long before they ordered the evacuations, but the main priority of the Soviet leadership was to contain the situation first and worry about their people later. The delayed evacuation undoubtedly led to countless unnecessary deaths and illnesses as a direct result of prolonged exposure to radiation. 115,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat or nearby towns on April 27th. The government continued to lie and withhold information from everyone who was in danger at the time, along with the rest of the world. The residents who had been evacuated were told it would only be temporary and they would be returning to their homes in the near future. This was a lie, and the Soviet leadership knew it. Nuclear experts had already informed them that the Chernobyl power plant and the surrounding region would remain irradiated for years to come. Even still, residents were told to only grab important documents and belongings, along with any food they could carry. Only days later, an exclusion zone was set up around Chernobyl. It extended 18.6 miles or 30 kilometers from the nuclear power plant and incorporated around 1,017 square miles or 2,634 square kilometers. However, this exclusion zone would later be expanded to include 1,600 square miles or 4,143 square kilometers to encompass several heavily irradiated areas outside the initial zone. No unauthorized personnel would be able to enter. In fact, the exclusion zone is still in place today. Anyone who was evacuated on April 27th would never see their homes again. Many would also die premature, horrible deaths as a result of radiation exposure from the meltdown at the power plant and the subsequent slow response of the Soviet government to evacuate non-essential personnel. On April 28, 1986, 2 days after the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded, Swedish air monitors detected a large amount of radiation coming from the south. The source of the radiation was traced back to the USSR. It could not be determined immediately where the radiation was coming from, and the silence of the Soviet Union made the Swedes extremely suspicious. If they were detecting the radiation, it must have meant that the Soviets were aware something within their border was releasing an enormous amount of irradiated particles in the atmosphere. The Swedish government immediately contacted the Kremlin for answers. Like with everything else during the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviets were slow to respond. Eventually, they informed the Swedes that there had been an accident. They did not elaborate or provide any further relevant information, but one thing was for sure. Since the radiation levels reaching Sweden were so high, it had to mean something extremely bad was going on within the Soviet borders. The Kremlin informed the Swedish government that everything was under control when nothing could be further from the truth. The exposed core of Reactor 4 was still ejecting huge amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, and it would not stop anytime soon. The following day, U.S. spy satellites confirmed what many had feared all along. The damage that the Chernobyl power plant had sustained was much worse than the Soviets were letting on. Reactor 4 was completely exposed, and around 30% of the power plant's 190 metric tons of uranium was being ejected into the atmosphere. If the Soviets didn't get the reactor fire under control and contain the radiation leak soon, neighboring nations might be facing their own crisis in the near future. It was not clear how far the radioactive particles would drift, so other countries in the region began taking precautions. On May 4th, a new set of containment crews started to work at Chernobyl and began pumping liquid nitrogen underneath the reactor to cool it down. 800,000 workers began the arduous job of containment and cleanup around the power plant. They needed to remove any contaminated debris that had been blown off the structure as the initial explosions ripped through the facility. Entire villages near the power plant were bulldozed, and any animals present in the exclusion zone were shot on sight. This included dogs, cats, livestock, and wildlife. Any radioactive rubble or waste was buried deep underground, which included the top layer of soil. Around 4 square miles in the exclusion zone became known as the Red Forest due to the reddish-brown color the leaves of trees had turned as they died from high amounts of radiation absorbed by their cells. Further away from the nuclear power plant, where the radiation levels were slightly lower, everything looked to be just fine. But when Geiger counters were brought in, it was found that radiation covered everything, and it would only be a matter of time before living things like plants and animals would show signs of radiation poisoning. Then on May 6th, the radioactive emissions being discharged from reactor number 4 decreased dramatically. This was most likely due to the fire in the core finally burning itself out, as up to this point, the Soviets were still having trouble dousing the fire in the reactor. As more and more people learned of the true extent of the disaster, the Soviet Union decided to take steps to protect its citizens. The Kremlin ordered officials in Kyiv to close schools and advised their citizens to stay inside. People were warned against consuming leafy greens and told to refrain from eating vegetables grown in the area until it could be confirmed they were free of radiation. In the future, it would be determined that the amount of radioactive particles released into the atmosphere far exceeded the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This demonstrated the danger that nuclear power plants could pose if not properly managed or without adequate safety measures in place. The radionuclides that were released from the destroyed reactor were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. Each of these radionuclides posed their own problems. Iodine-131 had a relatively short half-life of about 8 days. However, it could easily get into the human body through breathing contaminated air, consumption of leafy greens, or ingesting dairy products. If consumed this way, the iodine would then begin to build up in the thyroid gland. This posed a significant risk to infants and children who were ingesting large amounts of milk and dairy in their diets. The fact that their thyroid gland is smaller and children tend to have a faster metabolism than adults means that the radiation levels increase more rapidly. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation conducted a research study that concluded more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. This has been disputed by some, but there is no denying the fact that young children were much more vulnerable to radiation due to their diet and physiology. On May 8th, containment crews drained the last of the radioactive water that was located under the core. Unfortunately, much of the contaminated water had already flooded parts of the complex and leaked into soil around the reactor. Altogether, the workers removed around 20,000 tons of radioactive liquid and buried it in an undisclosed location around the exclusion zone. Once this was completed, the engineers at Chernobyl could start building the containment structure that would finally contain the last of the radiation being discharged from the core. To do this, they poured concrete under the reactor to serve as a foundation of what would become known as the sarcophagus. Unfortunately, like many of the things that had led up to the Chernobyl disaster, corners were cut, and experts were either ignored or never consulted. Even after the sarcophagus was well underway, many nuclear scientists and engineers pointed out that the sarcophagus was structurally unsound, which turned out to be painfully true in the years to come. The containment structure would need to be repaired several different times, and eventually an entirely new structure would need to be built to encase the crumbling sarcophagus. While the concrete was being poured for the original structure, radioactive debris was continuously being buried at around 800 different locations in the area. Again, due to incompetence and gross negligence of the Soviet leadership, many of the sites were not recorded properly, and it's likely that contaminated material could be located in unknown spots all around Chernobyl. Of the 800,000 workers who struggled to contain the radiation and removed radioactive debris and built the sarcophagus around the reactor, approximately 300,000 received 120 millisieverts of radiation, which is about 12 rads. A millisievert is the maximum limit of radiation an average member of the public should receive in a year. At sea level, people receive around 0.27 millisieverts, while at higher altitudes, populations tend to receive closer to 0.5 millisieverts from background radiation. Therefore, these workers received 500 times the radiation they would have if they had not been at Chernobyl. To put this into perspective, a CT scan typically hits a patient with around 9 millisieverts. So the workers at Chernobyl received over 10 times as much radiation as a CT scan for the duration of the time they worked at the site. This greatly increased their risk of developing cancer and other radiation-induced illnesses. On May 14, 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev, then president of the Soviet Union, made a public announcement for the first time about the disaster at Chernobyl. This was likely due to the increasing pressure from the international community and the ability to keep the Chernobyl disaster quiet any longer. It's unclear when or if the Kremlin would have acknowledged what happened at the nuclear power plant if Sweden and the United States didn't have evidence that forced their hand. Gorbachev promised the people of the Soviet Union and the world that the worst was over, but his words were meaningless, as for many their problems had just begun. Most of the radiation was carried east or north by wind currents, leading to radioactive particles being blown into Belarus, Russia, and across Ukraine. However, as weather patterns shifted, some of the radiation released from the Chernobyl disaster made its way to western France and Italy. Millions and millions of acres of land were doused with radiation across Europe, including forests, farmlands, and water sources. Even though people around the power plant and in the exclusion zone had been evacuated, many others were still in danger of receiving at least some radiation, and depending on their bodies, it could be enough to make them seriously ill. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, a significant percentage of livestock were found to be born deformed or with birth defects. One study discovered that around 33.5% of barn swallow chicks in the exclusion zone showed signs of abnormalities, while 17.8% of the adults showed signs of some sort of genetic alteration. The radiation from the disaster was affecting plants, animals, and humans. No one was safe from the radiation that had escaped from the exposed reactor. In late August 1986, the International Atomic Energy Agency held a conference where scientists and engineers examined the accident at Chernobyl and concluded it was the result of human error and a lack of adequate safety procedures. It was also found that there were several serious problems with the Soviets' reactor design that needed to be remedied if they hoped to avoid another catastrophe in the future. Hundreds of thousands of people needed to be relocated or protected from the initial fallout of Chernobyl. Subsequent studies concluded that the land immediately around the power plant would not be habitable for the next 20,000 years due to the high radioactivity in the area. However, this did not deter the Soviets from turning reactors 1, 2, and 3 back on. Even as cleanup efforts continued and the area around the power plant pulsed with radiation, workers and operators were sent back to the facility to ensure that the Soviet Union had the energy it needed. Many around the world could not believe the Soviets had turned on a system that only months before had a meltdown. But this is exactly what happened. Chernobyl continued to produce power for the next several years, even though another disaster could have been looming just over the horizon. Even after decades of study, it's still hard for scientists and doctors to measure the amount of damage the mistakes made at the Chernobyl power plant in 1986 have done. Most reports conclude that somewhere around 30 people died immediately after the explosion as a direct result of radiation exposure while combating fires, moving radioactive debris, or trying to get the blaze in the core under control. However, in the years following the initial disaster, as many as 4,000 people may have died from radiation-related cancers. Another 5,000 could still be at risk of developing similar illnesses even though they may have received a lower dose of radiation. Millions of people in the former Soviet Union and around Europe also suffered both mental and physical trauma as a result of being evacuated and forced to flee their homes during the crisis. There's also the very real possibility that the disaster might play a role in genetic diseases or abnormalities found in future generations born to parents who were at or near Chernobyl when it was spewing radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Interestingly, after several years, the wildlife and plant population in the exclusion zone did begin to recover. Without further human encroachment or destruction of the natural habitat in the area, elk, roe deer, wild boars, lynx, birds, and other wildlife have returned, and their numbers continue to grow. In fact, scientists have estimated that there are around 7 times more wolves in the exclusion zone than in the surrounding reserves. That being said, there are elevated levels of cataracts, albinism, and other genetic defects present in these populations. Chernobyl and the exclusion zone serve as an interesting case study on how reduced human activity in an area can influence wildlife populations. Even plants and trees have begun to regrow in the region, and although they too show signs of genetic alterations from radiation, the ecosystem itself is thriving. It's unclear if unexpected problems will arise in the wildlife populations in the future due to generations of prolonged exposure to high levels of radiation, but as of right now, the exclusion zone ecosystem seems to be flourishing without a human presence to disrupt it. However, the USSR did not fare so well. The Chernobyl disaster took a huge economic and political toll on the Soviet Union. It also made the general public incredibly wary about using nuclear power or living anywhere near a nuclear power plant. The repairing of Chernobyl, the containment effort, and the relocation of over 100,000 people are estimated to have cost the Soviet Union around $235 billion. What is now Belarus, but was a part of the Soviet Union at the time, lost 20% of its agricultural land and approximately a quarter of its total territory to contamination. In 1991, Belarus spent around 22% of its annual budget on disaster response efforts to clean up and decontaminate the land affected by the Chernobyl disaster. That same year, Chernobyl Unit 2 was shut down after a fire broke out in the building. The reactor was unaffected, but the close call led to it being ultimately shut down and never turned back on. In 1996, Reactor Number 1 was also shut down. For the next 4 years, Reactor Number 3 continued to operate and produce electricity for the area. Then, on December 15, 2000, 14 years after the disaster that left much of the surrounding area covered in high levels of radiation, the final reactor at Chernobyl power plant was shut down, and the facility was officially decommissioned. In 2016, the new Safe Confinement structure was completed and then moved into position over the sarcophagus housing Reactor Number 4. Over the years, there had been several radiation leaks detected in the old structure, as it was never meant to contain the reactor indefinitely. The new Safe Confinement structure will keep the core of Reactor Number 4 contained for the foreseeable future. The structure that's in place today was the result of an international design competition, in which the French companies Vinci Construction Grands Projects and Bouygues Travaux Publics won a €432 million contract. Later, they would hire the Dutch company Mammoet to help with the movement of the new Safe Confinement structure into position over the reactor. Containment efforts and cleanup of the surrounding area of Ukraine are slated to continue until 2065. As of 2019, 11 RBMK reactors are still operational in Russia. It's not clear what precautions, if any, have been taken at these other nuclear power plants to ensure that the same type of catastrophe that happened at Chernobyl doesn't happen again. But since the Kremlin remains untrusting of outsiders, and the leadership doesn't seem to be nearly as concerned about public safety or the well-being of their people as they are about invading neighboring countries, there's a good chance that one of these nuclear power plants could suffer a meltdown in the future. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine gained control of Chernobyl and the land around it. In 2011, the Ukrainian government opened Chernobyl and the abandoned city of Pripyat to scientists and tour groups. Today, no one lives or is allowed into the exclusion zone without permission from the government. And since Ukraine is currently fighting a war against Russian invaders at the moment, no new permits are being given out. Terrifyingly, a battle did break out around Chernobyl, and many were concerned that the containment structure would be breached during the fighting. This is a perfect example of how Putin and his regime have very little regard for the safety or lives of their own soldiers. It's unclear what the future of Chernobyl will look like once the war is all over, but it seems that the Kremlin has no plans to improve its track record around public or nuclear safety anytime soon. The helicopter skimmed over the exclusion zone,
the abandoned houses below hinting at the devastation. The only sound was the thump of the rotor blades echoing across the still night. It was a nearly impossible mission. Through the darkness, the largest loomed up ahead: Chernobyl. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls just as the radiation levels in his dosimeter began to spike into the red. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're telling the story of the pilots who flew into the Chernobyl core. On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl power plant catastrophically failed, shooting plumes of fire and deadly radiation into the night sky. The event sent shockwaves throughout the world. While some mourned from afar, others were called into action. The disaster would not go away on its own. People were needed on the ground. People who could clean up the mess, contain it, and figure out exactly what had gone wrong. People who would put their very lives at risk. Mykola Melnyk was born in 1953 near Kyiv, Ukraine. He was an accomplished helicopter pilot working as a test pilot for the Kamov Helicopter Design Bureau, until one day the Soviet Union called him to help out with the cleanup project. See, the Soviet Union desperately needed pilots. Ground crews couldn't even go near the reactor itself in the weeks following the disaster. Close to the reactor core, radiation levels hit 300 sieverts per hour, with levels around 200 sieverts per hour around the building itself. The safe dose for radiation workers? 20 millisieverts per year. It's even lower for the general public at 1 millisievert per year. According to experts of the time, this level of radiation would release a lethal dose for humans in just 1 minute. In the short term, even a radiation level of just 10 sieverts is fatal within a few weeks. So Chernobyl was a real problem for getting people in and out alive. But helicopters only needed to hover around the reactor site for a few seconds, exposing the pilot to significantly lower levels of radiation. While he would end up performing many missions for his government, Melnyk was the man in charge of one of the most important operations of all, Operation Needle. In mid-June, Melnyk's commanders asked him to do a training exercise in Moscow, one that seemed a bit random to him. Using his helicopter, he was supposed to drop a giant needle-like probe into a very precise spot, a mission that was deemed incredibly difficult, requiring coordination, expert flying skills, and superhuman precision. But Melnyk had been picked precisely because of his superior precision skills, something that earned him the nickname the Jeweler. And that day in Moscow, Melnyk succeeded, to the surprise of almost everyone. Observers were so excited they broke out into applause when Melnyk successfully executed the maneuver. But the famously transparent Soviet Union still wasn't going to inform the pilot about his mission. After all, they hadn't even informed the public or even other scientific communities and governments about what was going on. They only admitted that there had been an incident at all after the Finnish and Swedish governments called up to ask why there was suddenly a whole lot of radiation leaking into their airspace. And even then, the USSR assured those other countries that the Chernobyl incident was under control, which must have been news to everyone actually working on cleaning up the site. After completing a difficult training exercise, Melnyk heard of his upcoming mission while he was on his way to the Borispol airport in Kyiv. According to Melnyk himself, his reaction was, "Woe is my youth." Understandable since he was only 32 years old at the time of the mission, but he chose to put his life on the line for his country and its people. So on June 19, 1986 at 9 a.m., Melnyk found himself flying toward the Chernobyl reactor core on a deadly, serious mission. Sitting in a Kamov coaxial rotor helicopter, Melnyk was dragging along a 59-foot radiation probe. The point of Melnyk's mission was to drop this heavy cylindrical weight into a tiny circular opening above the reactor. The opening was about 3.3 feet across. That doesn't sound too small until you're trying to drop a probe nearly the same width from 1,300 feet up. Then it is tiny. Smaller, lighter probe operations had been suggested and immediately thrown out. Scientists had realized that most materials would immediately melt in the temperatures formed by the reactor core. In the days following the Chernobyl explosion, the reactor would continue to burn at around 4,700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about half as hot as the surface of the sun. The heavy needle that Melnyk was dragging had been built with the most effective casing possible for surviving the interior of the reactor. Because of the intense heat in the updrafts and the load it was carrying, the helicopter couldn't get too close to the reactor. It would have to pass over at a height of more than the whole Empire State Building above the opening while executing an incredibly difficult maneuver. Yet another complication? The opening wasn't really open. Scientists knew that a crust would have formed on it, a crust that the probe would have to break through in order to accomplish its task, which is why it had to not only be long, but also heavy. So absolutely no pressure on Melnyk. The needle's probe was covered in sensors that would feed scientists information on temperatures, gamma radiation, and neutron flux within the failed reactor. Even after a month, there was a strange glow coming from the reactor, and scientists had no idea what was going on, or what they needed to do to contain further damage, making this mission absolutely critical. Melnick started his flight well outside of the inner exclusion zone. Makeshift bases had been set up far away from the reactor so people could plan cleanup operations outside the 18.6-mile exclusion zone. As he approached, Melnick was aware that almost everything was working against him and the mission. First off, hermetically sealed Mi-24 helicopters had taken radiation readings above the reactor. They were the only ones that could hang around the power plant for that long, as they had special lead coatings, filters, and systems for maintaining air quality. Melnick knew that once he got directly above the reactor, even at 1,300 feet, he was gonna be blasted by radiation, around 3,000 Röntgens per hour, or 26 sieverts per hour. According to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, just 400 to 450 Röntgens, or about 4 to 4.5 sieverts, delivered over a few hours is enough to kill roughly 50% of the people exposed within 30 days. So 3,000 Röntgens was a real problem. Worse yet, because of the wind currents and other anomalies, certain spots around the reactor saw radiation levels of up to 20,000 Röntgens per hour. So, Melnick was flying over the eerily abandoned villages of the area, looking at the reactor core ahead, and praying. And as he got closer and closer to the core, his palms were sweating as he got ready to release the massive metal needle into the reactor core. A few hundred feet away, he ran into another problem. The high temperatures inside of the reactor caused severe turbulence. The heat and instability inside of the superheated air kept pushing out through the core's opening at the top. This created intense updrafts that started shaking Melnick's helicopter. Relying on a feed from the camera at the end of the metal needle, Melnick attempted to make the drop anyway. He released the needle, and he heard a clattering. His heart sank. The needle had missed its mark. Reports differ as to whether the frozen crust above the reactor core was hit at the wrong angle, or reinforced debris caused the needle to bounce off instead of dropping inside. Whatever it was, it meant one thing: Melnick would have to fly over the core and its intensely lethal radiation again. He turned his helicopter to make another pass. At this point, he was hoping his sweaty hands were due to his nerves and not radiation sickness. He checked the camera feed and he couldn't believe it. The first failed drop had damaged the camera. Melnick was flying blind. He would have to rely on the 3 operational crew on board to confirm that he could drop the needle. But the radiation that they were being exposed to wasn't just affecting them, it could seriously affect the helicopter they were flying in. The Chernobyl explosion released a huge burst of gamma radiation into the atmosphere, along with some alpha and beta radiation. The gamma radiation was especially problematic as it penetrates both structural and electrical components of the aircraft. The structural issues would show up over time. Degradation of the rotor blades, for example, and this would make the helicopters useless in the long run. Which is why the Air Force Ministry in Belarus eventually announced that every helicopter used for the Chernobyl cleanup was destroyed and buried. Radiation damage to the engines and lower fuselages made them unfit for flying. But Melnick's concern was damage to the electronics. This could be more severe, more direct, and more deadly. Gamma rays disrupt crystalline structure, meaning that all the zeros and the ones in a digital circuit could be flipped by gamma radiation, corrupting all the data. Even more problematic, for a helicopter at the time at least, gamma rays ionize and therefore damage semiconductors. And in helicopters, semiconductors are everywhere, from navigation to radios to flight control systems to the actual displays in the cockpit. Melnick really couldn't afford to lose even one of those systems. As Melnick approached, once again dropping the needle toward the reactor, another miss. His hope and that of the crews was rapidly disappearing. Melnick made yet another turn for a third attempt. At the same time, he couldn't escape a nagging thought. He and his crew had been in the heavily irradiated air for almost 30 minutes. The helicopter provided some protection, but not a lot. Instead of flying the special Mi-26S, scientifically developed for Chernobyl cleanup, a helicopter that could carry heavy loads while being equipped with protective screens and filters, Melnick was flying a Kamov. Why? No one is 100% sure. Some say the Kamov's unique rotor design made it better suited for a mission that required this insane level of precision. The crew were taking all the precautions they'd been advised to take, carrying personal dosimeters, changing clothes after each flight, eating vitamin-rich meals, even using creams and medicine that their superiors gave to them to increase their resistance to radiation. But even they knew most of those precautions were for show and largely ineffective. Unfortunately, the men would have no idea how much radiation they had taken on until much later. And it's unclear if they even took the one precaution that could have actually protected them: iodine pills. One of the isotopes released during the Chernobyl disaster was iodine-131, which can lead to thyroid cancer. The cases of thyroid cancer in Ukrainian children after Chernobyl, though rare to begin with, increased around 200%. The problem? Your body recognizes the radioactive iodine as regular iodine and it stores it in your thyroid. Iodine pills flood your system with safe iodine so your body won't be able to absorb the radioactive kind. Otherwise, that radioactive iodine sits in your thyroid, steadily firing off radiation and damaging the DNA the whole time it's in there. But the distribution to iodine pills at the first responders at Chernobyl was completely haphazard and disorganized, so much so that we still have little idea of who actually got them and when. They're only really effective when given within 2 or a maximum of 8 hours after exposure. If Melnik was given iodine pills on his 3rd day in Chernobyl, they might as well have been placebos. Knowing that he has almost no real protection for himself or his helicopter, Melnik lined up the core in his sights, determined to finally make this drop. It was do or die. Through dust and debris, he aimed directly for the core. The radioactive dust, melted debris, and cleanup equipment everywhere made the approach a minefield. In fact, on October 2, 1986, an Mi-8 helicopter dropping sand and lead on the reactor to contain the radioactivity and damage crashed after flying too close to a crane in the area. A sudden gust spun the crane, and with the sun in his eyes and visibility already bad, the pilot didn't see the crane arm swinging toward him until it was too late. The helicopter's rotor blades hit a chain, bringing the entire thing crashing down. This incident happened months after Melnik's mission. But as an experienced aviator, he already understood how dangerous the area was. Flying within just dozens of feet of the reactor, he worked to drop the metal cylinder as straight as possible, hoping that it would punch through the crust. The needle fell. Melnik held his breath, and then he heard it break through. It rapidly fell, with more than 2/3 of it embedding into the building. Relieved at least for the moment, Melnik turned the helicopter and flew away. But his mission wasn't over. He still had to drop a 650 to 985-foot cable on the correct side of the building. Ground crews could then pull it up into a safe room and attach it to their equipment. Like almost everything else in this mission, though, whether due to horrible luck, radiation interference, or horrible environmental conditions, the drop went wrong. The lock failed and the cable landed in the wrong spot. The situation was only salvaged because a team of USSR scientists were walking through the building just minutes later and they saw the cable dangling outside of a window. Without a second thought, Vyacheslav Pismeny, a doctor of physics, broke the glass to get the cable, while another man behind him helped pull it into the building. That other man was Yevgeny Velikov, the former vice president of the USSR Academy of Sciences. Chernobyl was truly an all-hands-on-deck kind of moment. Everyone just put on whatever hat was violently thrown at them at the moment. Melnik and his crew arrived back at the base. They'd been in the air for 36 minutes. Later on, doctors would find that Melnik had been exposed to radiation levels at least 10 times above the permitted level. Between May 20th, 1986 and September 9th, 1986, Melnik would complete 46 different sorties with 52 hours of flight time in the area. For his troubles, he received the Soviet Union's highest honor, the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union. Years later, the International Federation of Helicopter Pilots also honored him and his whole team, as well as the other pilots involved in the multi-month Chernobyl cleanup. They admiringly called them those crazy Russians. Though the probe he dropped provided a lot of useful information to scientists, it was sending temperature readings that didn't make any sense. Years later, people would discover that the probe had landed not in the reactor pit, but in the spent fuel pool. And the honors would do little to prevent the inevitable fallout from his mission. None of Melnik's 3 crew members would make it to 50 years old. One died at 39, another at 40, and the third at 48. Melnik himself survived to the age of 59, but not without problems. In 1994, he needed 2 separate surgeries for complications caused by his radiation exposure. His doctors advised him to cut out drinking and smoking to give himself the best chance of a long life. Melnik ignored them because, as he later told a reporter, "I decided I would live the way I like, not limiting myself in anything." And after what he had been through, who could blame him? He eventually died in 2013 in Spain, where he spent the last years of his life as a test pilot and a trainer for local pilots. The 1986 accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in today's Ukraine was undoubtedly the worst nuclear disaster in history. To put things into perspective, this incident released more than 400 times as much radioactive material as the atomic bomb that devastated Hiroshima in 1945.
The Chernobyl disaster claimed 30 lives directly, and according to many experts, thousands indirectly. The once vibrant town of Pripyat, located near the ill-fated power plant, was evacuated, transforming it into a ghost town in less than 36 hours. How could a disaster of this magnitude have ever happened? On the surface, the Chernobyl disaster was the product of a remarkable range of human errors and specific reactor features, which compounded and amplified the effects of errors. As the 1986 summary report on the post-accident review meeting on the Chernobyl accident put it, in simpler terms, mistakes made by plant operators and a flawed reactor design were to blame for this unprecedented disaster. But is that all there is to it? Given the enormity of the Chernobyl disaster and its far-reaching consequences, it's easy to understand the answer to this question is no. Look at it this way. Every war has its immediate and underlying cause. Take World War I as an example. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the immediate cause of the devastating war. But beneath the surface, an intricate web of alliances, nationalism, and militarism fueled the flame. Similar complexities underlie the Chernobyl disaster. Sure, human error and poor reactor design caused the infamous reactor number 4 to explode, but it was a systemic failure in the Soviet nuclear program's management that turned Chernobyl into a ticking time bomb. Essentially, it was a culture of secrecy, a lack of transparency, and inadequate safety protocols that ultimately ignited the catastrophic nuclear flame, not just technical shortcomings. So when exploring the causes behind the largest nuclear disaster in history, we'll look at every component of this lethal mix. Let's start with the underlying causes. Though many people, primarily Soviets, blamed the Chernobyl disaster on the operators' recklessness and lack of competence, their actions on that fateful April night were, above all, a direct reflection of the prevailing safety culture of the Soviet era, or, to be precise, a lack of safety culture. You see, despite being one of the world leaders in nuclear technology, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics failed to implement and prioritize adequate safety practices for the technology. At best, these practices can be described as limited, while calling the Soviet approach to safety lax might even be a compliment. But let's dig a little deeper. How did this lack of safety culture enable the Chernobyl disaster? For starters, Soviet safety policies never accounted for a catastrophe of such magnitude. When creating the policies, Soviet decision-makers only factored in so-called realistic scenarios. This is on par with designers behind the reactors used in the Chernobyl power plant, who didn't consider catastrophic scenarios when determining the most extreme malfunction these reactors should be able to cope with, or the so-called maximum design accident, or MDA. They had no interest in those only remotely possible scenarios, leaving the Soviet power plants ill-equipped to handle them. For instance, a Soviet power plant could generally handle an isolated break in the largest coolant-carrying pipe. But something like the reactor core melting was dismissed as virtually impossible and thus not covered by any safety protocols. Also, the reactor's operating reactivity margin, or ORM, was only seen as a way to control the reactor power and not as a crucial safety parameter. And let's not forget the complete lack of any safety features in the plant, such as concrete containment and water moderators. Interestingly, the Soviets believed that the approach increased the overall safety of their power plants. That might seem counterintuitive, but here's how they saw it. Too many unnecessary backup systems can only lead to operational complexities, thus decreasing overall safety. While this explanation might seem somewhat rational, the events that transpired during the Chernobyl disaster clearly exposed a fatal flaw of this perspective. Now, you might wonder, is it possible that no one in the USSR saw how tragically flawed this perspective was? To answer the question, we must first examine how the Soviets approached monitoring, reporting, and overall transparency, especially in the nuclear sector. Recognizing the potential power of the sector, the USSR heavily invested in the development of nuclear power facilities. The development of these facilities was followed by organizations tasked with supervising their safety. So far, so good, isn't it? Well, not quite. You see, the primary organization tasked with this role was Gosatomnadzor, the State Committee for the Supervision of Nuclear Power Safety. But this organization wasn't independent. Instead, it operated within the framework of established Soviet bureaucratic entities in charge of power production. In other words, these so-called supervisors were actually subordinates of their supervisees. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that no red flags were raised surrounding the neglect of the existing nuclear equipment or any potential mistakes in its management. The supervisors of the Chernobyl power plant and every other Soviet establishment simply behaved as most Soviets at the time. They feared authority and did their best to please the political superiors. This compliance-driven culture is what prevented the operators concerned about the safety of the test that would lead to the Chernobyl disaster from voicing their concerns and alerting their superiors. Of course, such poor reporting was nothing new for the Soviets. They boasted about not experiencing a single major failure with their reactors in the late 1970s, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Though there are few details, no surprise there, it appears that the USSR had experienced at least 5 major reactor incidents preceding the Chernobyl disaster. In 1974, a coolant loop ruptured in a Leningrad nuclear power station, killing 3 individuals and spilling highly radioactive water into the environment. Just 3 years later, half the fuel assemblies in the Beloyarsk nuclear power plant melted, exposing the operators to severe radiation. Another accident occurred in 1985, when human error caused a safety valve to explode at Balakovo nuclear power plant, killing 14 people. Believe it or not, we have yet to cover the worst Chernobyl disaster precursor incidents. The first of the 2 most alarming accidents preceding the Chernobyl disaster happened in 1957 when a waste storage tank at the Mayak Production Association, a nuclear weapons production site, exploded. Though this disaster claimed no lives directly, it caused numerous radiation-related illnesses and cancers in tens of thousands of people living nearby. The Mayak disaster is one of the worst nuclear incidents in history, ranking second by radioactivity released. The only disaster that released more radioactivity was the Chernobyl disaster itself. Yet, chances are this is the first time you hear of the Mayak disaster. Why? Well, the answer is simple: secrecy, secrecy, and also some more secrecy. Not even the residents in the affected areas were initially informed about the incident. Instead, they were simply evacuated without any explanation. It would take 18 years for the world to learn the true extent of the disaster. If this weren't the case, perhaps the Soviets would have adequately prepared for the Chernobyl disaster. But there's no point in playing this woulda, coulda, shoulda game with an accident that happened some 1,500 miles away and 29 years before the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Especially given an incident taking place just 4 years prior at the same plant wasn't enough to break the chains of secrecy. That's right, the 1986 disaster wasn't the first serious incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. In 1982, during a trial run for a scheduled reactor shutdown, one of the pressure channels broke and released radiation into the reactor compartment. Major General Valkolenko, who reported on the incident, stated that repairing the broken channel would take 5 days and emphasized there was no high radioactive contamination at the premises. However, a secret report would later show that contamination had actually reached an area of as many as 9 miles surrounding the power plant. Hiding these accidents from the Soviet public and the foreign observers was bad enough, but in most cases they were also hidden from other nuclear power personnel. This astonishing lack of transparency prevented shared learning that could have led to an improvement in engineering and procedural flaws. Now, you might think that once the Chernobyl disaster struck, this secrecy went out the window, and the Soviets did everything in their power to mitigate the consequences as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, you'd be very wrong. The immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster revealed a continuation of the same old patterns. Downplay the severity of the incident. Delegate any important decisions up the chain of command. Wait for bureaucratic processes to unfold. Repeat. Even though the tests performed in Pripyat within hours of the explosion showed alarmingly high levels of radioactivity, 4.5 Röntgen per day to be precise, no evacuation was ordered. This order would come more than 34 hours after the incident, when the levels of radiation reached 600 milliröntgens per hour. To better understand that figure, think of it this way. The Pripyat residents were subjected to a full-body CT scan every hour. Compounding the issue, these poor residents were given only an hour and a half to pack their belongings and evacuate. Had this decision been made sooner, the Pripyat residents wouldn't have been exposed to so much radiation, which eventually led to thyroid cancer in many individuals, primarily children. Paradoxically, the Chernobyl disaster occurred while the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was attempting to reform the country through 2 primary policies: glasnost and perestroika. You'll immediately understand what's paradoxical about this once you learn that glasnost focused on increasing transparency and openness within the Soviet governmental system, promising better communication between the authorities and the public. Surprising to no one, this communication was nowhere to be seen in the aftermath of Chernobyl, demonstrating that nothing truly changed within the Union. As always, the government cowered and remained silent at first and then took the deny route. While addressing the Chernobyl disaster for the first time on TV, May 14, 1986, Gorbachev slammed international reports on this incident as malicious lies. However, this time the Soviet public didn't fall for this, leading to widespread distrust. Eventually, the policies that were meant to save the Soviet Union failed, taking the entire Union with them. With this in mind, it became clear why Gorbachev cited Chernobyl as the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But let's not dive too deep into the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster just yet. Sure, we've covered all the primary underlying causes of this catastrophic event so far, but we're yet to explore the immediate causes of the world's largest nuclear disaster. As already mentioned, there were two of them: poor reactor design and human error. Though these factors should never be discussed in isolation, it's important to recognize them as major elements in causing the Chernobyl disaster. As far as reactors go, one thing was abundantly clear to anyone who came into contact with these Soviet creations. The RBMK reactors used at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant were inherently unsafe. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, as previously explained, these reactors weren't investigated by any independent safety bodies. If competent, independent experts were allowed to inspect these reactors, they would likely raise two red flags: the physical characteristics that prompted them to act unstable, and the complete and total lack of efficient safety systems. Both of these can be explained by the fact that the USSR started their nuclear power program behind other developed nations and tried to catch up by any means necessary. This also meant completely ignoring the human factor when designing the reactors. As you can imagine, this led to nothing good. The RBMK reactors had a unique design that combined graphite as a moderator instead of water and a water coolant. Graphite was used because it was cost-effective yet allowed for significantly higher energy output. However, graphite is also quite unpredictable. In water-moderated reactors, water will become less effective in facilitating a reaction as it gets hotter. Graphite, on the other hand, will keep promoting the reaction even if the temperature escalates. The only way to put a stop to the reaction is to lower boron carbide control rods into the reactor. The more control rods go in, the more effectively the reaction is controlled. But as the Chernobyl disaster showed, this design characteristic was widely unsafe. As you'll soon learn, once the control rods were lowered during the Chernobyl disaster, they jammed. But the trouble lay in their graphite tips, which not only prevented the boron in the control rods from slowing the reaction, but actually contributed to a surge in reactivity. The water cooling system further exacerbated the situation and ultimately caused the explosion in the reactor. But it's still not time to discuss the human errors that led to the system activating, not when there are more unsafe characteristics of the RBMK reactors to break down. Another crucial feature of these reactors that proved to be highly unsafe was the positive void coefficient. This coefficient is what predominantly contributed to the overall power coefficient in the RBMK reactors. What is the positive void coefficient? The positive void coefficient refers to the reactor's response to the formation of voids and steam bubbles in the coolant. In traditional reactor designs used in the West, an increase in voids tends to reduce reactivity, thus acting as a self-regulating mechanism. However, in the RBMK reactors, reactivity increases as voids or steam bubbles form, which is precisely what happened during the Chernobyl disaster. The rapid rise in reactivity exacerbated the uncontrollable chain reaction, contributing to the severity of the catastrophe. However, the lack of a proper containment structure made this event even more disastrous. In the West, this structure comes in the form of a concrete and steel dome located over the reactor and designed to keep the radiation inside the power plant in the event of an accident. The radiation shield used for the RBMK reactors wasn't enough to contain the release of radioactive materials after the reactor number 4 exploded, leading to elements like plutonium, strontium, and iodine being dispersed over a wide area. But where do the power plant operators fit in this narrative? To understand why human error was first identified as the culprit for the Chernobyl disaster, let's look at what precisely happened on April 26, 1986, explaining where the power plant operators went wrong. The trouble started on April 25th, when the 4th reactor was to shut down for routine maintenance. The reactor crew at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant decided to take advantage of the shutdown to determine how the reactor would behave following the loss of station power. Their goal was to establish whether the slowing turbine would produce enough electrical power to sustain the reactor's safety systems until the emergency power supply kicked in. This test had already been attempted a year prior, but the energy from the turbine was insufficient to keep the safety systems running. That's why the crew decided to repeat the test using newly developed voltage regulators. Unfortunately, the team conducting the test didn't consult the personnel in charge of the safety of the nuclear reactor, which proved to be the fatal mistake. Here's how the operators put reactor number 4 in a dangerously unstable condition, which essentially guaranteed an accident. The reactor shutdown commenced on April 25th at 1:06 a.m. by gradually lowering the power level. This process was halted at 3:47 a.m. as the electrical load dispatcher insisted on maintaining a minimum power level for grid stability. At 2 p.m., the operator shut off the reactor's emergency core cooling system to prevent it from interrupting the test. Though this move didn't contribute to the accident, leaving the system on could have at least slightly reduced its impact. Over 9 hours would pass before the grid controller agreed to recommence the power reduction. This took place at 11:10 p.m., followed by a shift change at midnight. Here's where the real trouble started. Only half an hour after midnight, the power rapidly dropped to 30 megawatts thermal. To understand just how bad this is, you should know that the operation of the reactor below 700 megawatts thermal was strictly forbidden. This sudden drop was likely due to operational error. Either the operator failed to give the hold power at required level signal, or the system failed to respond to such a signal. The operators tried to increase the power to an acceptable level but were met with several challenges, including xenon poisoning and reduced coolant void. To respond to these challenges, the operators withdrew numerous power rods, thus violating the minimum operating reactivity margin, or ORM, of 15 rods. However, this move did result in stabilizing the reactor at about 200 megawatts thermal by 1 a.m., which encouraged the operators to proceed with the test. The test commenced at approximately 1:23 a.m., but only after the operators made a few more mistakes. For instance, they enabled additional cooling pumps around 1:07 a.m., which caused them to remove more rods to prevent power levels from falling. According to some calculations, only 8 rods were left inside the reactor, and if you remember, the minimum ORM required is at least 15. Once the test started, it took about 40 seconds before things started getting terribly wrong. At 1:23 a.m. and 40 seconds, an operator pressed the emergency AZ5 button, lowering all of the control rods into the reactor's core, intending to shut down the reactor. Some believe that this move was what caused the sudden power excursion. It took only 3 seconds for the power to reach 530 megawatts thermal, showing no signs of slowing down. This caused fuel elements to rupture, increasing steam generation and further boosting power due to a large positive void coefficient. And let's remember, the Soviet reactors only accounted for an isolated element breaking down. At this point, several fuel channels ruptured, increasing the pressure in the reactor. This pressure was so great that the reactor's radiation shield, a 1,000-ton support plate, detached, causing the control rods to jam about halfway down into the reactor. And then, complete and utter chaos. The emergency cooling circuit ruptured, feeding water into the core and causing intense steam generation. Here's when the first explosion took place. Another explosion ensued just 2 to 3 seconds later, likely caused by the buildup of hydrogen from zirconium steam reactions. The second explosion threw out fuel and hot graphite, starting a number of fires. By the end of these explosions, the reactor's core was completely exposed to the atmosphere. The core continued to burn for days after the accident, releasing radioactive particles into the environment. In an effort to extinguish the blaze, helicopters dropped some 5,000 tons of sand, clay, lead, boron, and dolomite onto the core for almost 10 days straight. About 300 tons of water was also injected per hour into the intact half of the reactor. But these efforts were soon stopped out of fear of flooding reactors number 1 and 2. Eventually, the remains of the reactor number 4 were encased in a hastily constructed concrete and steel structure known as the sarcophagus. Given how fast it was built, it shouldn't be surprising that this structure significantly deteriorated over the years, calling for several repairs. However, the ultimate plan under the Shelter Implementation Plan project by the Chernobyl Shelter Fund was to build a new, more secure and permanent structure around the existing one. The structure, called the New Safe Confinement (NSC), was completed in 2017, spanning over 850 feet. But what happened to the people and the environment surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant throughout all those years? Though this video primarily focuses on the causes of the Chernobyl disaster, this catastrophe can't possibly be discussed without mentioning the terrible aftermath. As previously mentioned, the disaster claimed 30 lives directly. 2 of them were power plant workers who died as a result of the initial explosion in the reactor. The rest of the casualties were firefighters and emergency cleanup workers, who mostly died from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, in the first 3 months after the accident. They were exposed to up to 20,000 milligrays of radiation in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. To understand just how high that is, you should know that ARS occurs when an individual is exposed to more than 700 milligrays of radiation. This makes such a high dose of radiation 100% fatal. But what about the residents in the affected areas? How did the radiation affect them? Well, for starters, the entire town of Pripyat, a little over 49,000 residents, was evacuated 36 hours after the accident. The evacuations continued in the subsequent weeks and months, resulting in around 200,000 people being resettled into less contaminated areas. The Chernobyl disaster took a severe toll on the physical and mental health of the affected residents. As far as physical health goes, there were at least 1,800 documented cases of thyroid cancer in children following the accident. In the mental health department, the worst consequence was the instances of suicide among the affected population. Tragically, this population also includes Valery Lagasov, the Soviet chemist who played a key role in the initial response to the Chernobyl disaster. Legasov hanged himself in his Moscow apartment the day after the second anniversary of the disaster, and a day before he was supposed to present the findings of his investigation into the causes of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident. Having learned the causes of this terrible accident in this video, you can probably understand why the weight of such knowledge, combined with the broader impact on public health and the environment, took a heavy toll on individuals like Valery Legasov. Which is more deadly, 2 atomic bombs or 1 nuclear reactor? In 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. The first detonated over Hiroshima, killing up to 140,000 people. The second exploded above Nagasaki, resulting in the deaths of approximately 70,000 men, women, and children. In 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant suffered a meltdown, leading to an explosion and a fire. Only 30 people died initially at Chernobyl, with an additional 30 dying in the weeks following. So the answer to our original question seems pretty obvious. Why then are Hiroshima and Nagasaki thriving cities, while Chernobyl is little more than an abandoned wasteland? Let's find out. To uncover why millions of people can safely inhabit cities devastated by atomic bombs, while areas around a single nuclear reactor meltdown remain uninhabited, we must delve into the science of radioactive decay, challenge prevailing misconceptions, and examine the critical role of location in nuclear disasters. While all 3 events caused suffering and loss of life, only one resulted in enduring environmental consequences. The subtle differences between the 1945 events in Japan and the 1986 incident in the former Soviet Union had profound implications for the long-term prospects of each region. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the atomic age by being the first and only nuclear weapons to be used in warfare. The Chernobyl disaster, on the other hand, occurred during the heightened tensions of the Cold War and was not the result of an attack, but negligence and several avoidable mistakes. Today, approximately 1.194 million people live in Hiroshima, 430,000 in Nagasaki, and almost 0 in Chernobyl. However, around 7,000 people, such as scientists, engineers, and safety personnel, still work at the decommissioned power plant and in the surrounding area. Although some of the workers at Chernobyl inhabit the abandoned apartments and buildings near the power plant, they only live there part-time while they're scheduled to work due to dangerous levels of radiation. This is a far cry from the bustling cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where generations of families have made their homes. 3 main factors have led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki being vibrant, bustling cities, while Chernobyl remains a seemingly radioactive wasteland. The first has to do with the location and the altitude. The height at which the bombs detonated versus where the nuclear core melted down played a major role in the amount of radiation in the area. Second, the quantity of fissionable material in each situation differed greatly, especially when it came to Chernobyl. Third, the byproducts produced from each disaster varied due to the timing and the composition of each occurrence. But before we get to the physics and the in-depth analysis of each of these events to understand why Hiroshima and Nagasaki look so different compared to Chernobyl today, we need to go back in time. The way events unfolded in each instance will help us better understand why you can hop on a plane and visit 2 cities in Japan that were nothing more than smoldering rubble less than 80 years ago, but you can't spend any significant amount of time in the desolate Ukrainian town of Chernobyl. On August 6, 1945 at 2:45 a.m., Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. pushed the throttle of the B-29 superfortress, the Enola Gay, forward. The engines roared to life. The aircraft picked up speed as it raced down the runway. Tibbets pulled back on the flight stick. The plane rose into the air. Its takeoff was a little dicey due to the modifications made to the aircraft, allowing it to deploy its special cargo. Moments later, 2 other B-29s took off from the U.S. airfield on Tinian Island. They would provide the reconnaissance for the Enola Gay to ensure her conditions were adequate to drop the bomb. They would also be used to film the weapon's detonation and document the immediate aftermath. Once the Enola Gay reached cruising altitude, Captain William Parsons began adding the final components to Little Boy. This was not done before takeoff because several modified B-29s had crashed during test flights. A major concern was that if a B-29 crashed with a fully assembled bomb on board, it might detonate and wipe out the entire military base on Tinian Island. This might have served as a demonstration of the destructive power of the atomic bomb, but not in the way the U.S. had hoped for. Therefore, the nuclear device aboard the Enola Gay was not fully assembled until the B-29 was in the air and a safe distance away. After a flight of approximately 1,568 miles, or 2,524 kilometers to Hiroshima, Japan, Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. relinquished the controls of the Enola Gay to Bombardier Thomas Farabee, who looked through the sighting lens at the city below. Farabee spotted the Ioi Bridge crossing over the Ota River. Before the war, Hiroshima had been the 7th largest city in Japan, with a population of just over 340,000. It governed and served as an economic hub for the country's southwestern region. Once the conflict began, Hiroshima became one of the most important command centers on the island. A major part of the Chugoku Regional Army was stationed there, along with the military supply depots and factories. The city also served as an important shipping point for Japanese soldiers and supplies. The United States had heavily bombed the surrounding area, but the factories were still churning out weapons and vehicles. Colonel Tibbets ordered his crew to put on their protective goggles. Farabee wiped his brow and pushed his face against the sighting apparatus one last time. He spotted his target and dropped the bomb at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945. The moment the bomb was away, Tibbets banked the B-29 hard in hopes of reaching safety before the atomic blast erupted. A second before the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, Little Boy descended to an altitude of 1,900 feet. The gun assembly device fired, and critical mass was achieved when a uranium projectile struck the uranium target within the bomb. This resulted in a chain reaction. Atoms split, neutrons were ripped from their nuclei, creating a massive amount of energy that culminated in an atomic explosion directly over the Shima Hospital in Hiroshima. The moment the bomb detonated, the temperature directly below the blast reached 12,600 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 7,000 degrees Celsius. Everything within the vicinity was immediately incinerated, including people, vehicles, and buildings. The blast wave leveled all structures within the radius, destroying around 2/3 of the city. Out of the 343,000 inhabitants living in Hiroshima, around 70,000 were killed almost instantly. Another 30,000 died within the year from severe burns and radiation poisoning. Milliseconds after detonation, the fireball created by the atomic bomb expanded to 900 feet, or 275 meters above ground zero. The blast wave decimated the city, shattering windows for dozens of miles, and it could be felt up to 37 miles or 60 kilometers away. Fires erupted across Hiroshima as anything flammable ignited from the intense heat. Everything within 4.4 miles or 7 kilometers of the blast's epicenter was incinerated in the raging inferno. This includes schools, churches, hospitals, and homes. The densely packed urban center contained 3/5 of the total population, where the most destruction occurred. The streets of Hiroshima became eerily quiet. The only sounds heard were the crackling of wood burning and structures crumbling. Shadows of people who had been vaporized were cast into the stone of the buildings. These nuclear shadows had appeared when the initial blast bleached everything in the area. Human bodies, lampposts, and anything solid that blocked the brilliant flash of energy and light had protected the structures that they were in front of. The resulting shadows were the stone and concrete's true colors before the atomic bomb detonated. Anything that was not shielded had decades of dirt and filth burnt away from the intense heat of the blast. At Sumitomo Bank, the shadow of a man holding a walking stick was forever cast in the steps, as his body was completely vaporized. 3 minutes after the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud from the blast rose higher and higher into the air, reaching 40,000 feet above the ground. Less than 1% of the uranium contained within Little Boy achieved fission, yet the destruction was utterly unbelievable. The bomb released the equivalent of more than 15,000 tons of TNT on the city of Hiroshima. Sergeant Bob Karen was the only crew member of the Enola Gay who actually saw the blast, as he was the plane's tail gunner. He described the detonation of Little Boy over Hiroshima as a peep into hell. The co-pilot, Captain Robert Lewis, looked back at the mushroom cloud rising into the sky. "My God, what have we done?" he said. On August 9, 1945, at 3:47 a.m., the boxcar, a B-29 loaded with the Fat Man atomic bomb, took off from Tinian Island and proceeded toward Japan. Major Charles Sweeney was at the controls. The bomb the boxcar carried was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. It was plutonium-fueled, similar to the bomb detonated during the Trinity test at Alamogordo bombing range. While taking off, Sweeney was particularly careful. Unlike the Little Boy bomb, Fat Man was already completely assembled in his cargo hold. Once the plane was safely in the air, Commander Frederick Ashworth armed the bomb. Again, 2 other B-29s accompanied the boxcar on its mission to aid in sighting the target. At the time of takeoff, clear skies with light haze were reported over the primary target of Kokura. Sweeney piloted the plane toward the destination. At 9:45 a.m., Sweeney reported that he couldn't see anything on the ground. The weather over Kokura had deteriorated. The visibility of the city below was nearly zero. This may have been caused by the firebombing runs conducted on the nearby city of Yahata the night before. Sweeney decided to circle back for another pass. On the second time around, the city below was still covered by haze and clouds. There was no telling where the target was and when to drop the bomb. "Can anyone see anything?" Sweeney shouted as he circled back for one more pass, but everyone reported back negative. Sweeney checked the fuel gauge. They'd been circling above Kokura for nearly 45 minutes. The clouds had not cleared. Time was slowly slipping away. Sweeney decided to give up on their primary objective and move to the secondary target of Nagasaki. At 10:58 a.m., 4 minutes before the second atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, the city of Nagasaki was obscured from view by more clouds. Captain Kermit Behan was a bombardier on the mission and looked through the scope to try to locate the Mitsubishi arms plant. The structure was supposed to be their target in Nagasaki. Moments before Sweeney was going to call off the mission, a clearing in the clouds appeared in the city's northern section. It was not their pre-planned target, but it was close enough that the bomb would take out the arms plant in the blast. At 11:02 a.m., the Fat Man atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The nuclear device fell to an altitude of 1,650 feet. The detonation mechanism triggered. The subcritical plutonium core was surrounded by several thousand pounds of explosives. They were arranged in a way that when they fired, the explosive forces were directed inward toward the plutonium core. The force of the explosion crushed the plutonium into a supercritical state, and a nuclear chain reaction commenced. This type of atomic bomb created a much bigger explosion than Little Boy. Fat Man went off with a force of 21,000 tons of TNT. 40,000 people were instantly vaporized, and another 30,000 would die in the aftermath from radiation poisoning. 40% of the city's buildings were destroyed. As the mushroom cloud erupted into the air, the shockwave struck the boxcar, rattling the plane's hull. Sweeney regained control and steered the craft further away from the spreading debris cloud. Something to note before we briefly examine what happened at the Chernobyl power plant is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki both occurred high above the cities and only lasted for seconds. The fires, the fallout, and the destruction that ensued after the bombs detonated lasted for days, weeks, and months after each event. However, the release of energy and radiation from the bombs themselves was over fairly quickly. The same cannot be said about the Chernobyl disaster. In 1977, Soviet engineers and workers constructed 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site, which would become the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, just south of the Belarus border in Ukraine, about 65 miles or 104 kilometers north of Kyiv. After the disaster, this facility would simply be known as Chernobyl. By the following year, one of the reactors would be brought online, and in 1984 the plant would have 4 active reactors with a 5th under construction. Each of the reactors was capable of producing around 1,000 megawatts of electric power. On April 25, 1986 at 1 in the morning, the operators at Chernobyl reduced the power being sent to reactor number 4 as they prepared to run a safety test on the system. This was done at the same time that routine maintenance was being carried out. The test itself would determine if the still spinning turbines of the reactor could continue to produce enough electricity to keep the coolant pumps operating if there was ever a complete loss of power at the plant. They needed the data to surmise whether the gap between a power loss and the time it took for the emergency generators to kick in would result in a nuclear meltdown or a catastrophic failure. As the sun rose, the tests were put on hold since the energy demands on the power plant would be highest during the day when the inhabitants of the surrounding areas were awake. At 11:10 p.m., operators at Chernobyl received word that they could continue the test. However, the shift change was just about to happen, so rather than starting the test and switching operators, the shutdown was again delayed. At midnight, the new shift came in. Just after midnight, the workers were informed that the experiment was to commence once again. The power output of reactor number 4 was lowered to 720 megawatts. The reactor was not designed to go below 700 megawatts for a sustained period of time. But for some reason, most likely due to poor oversight and training, the night shift operators at Chernobyl were unaware of the safety measure. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26th, the reactor reached 500 megawatts. The local control system switched over to the automatic regulating system as energy output became dangerously low. In order to remedy the situation, the operators scrambled to remove many of the control rods in the reactor, which directly violated the safety guidelines at the power plant. This decision did not have the desired effect. A buildup of xenon on the core caused the power levels to drop even further. Either due to human error or a malfunction in the system, the reactor's output fell to 30 megawatts. By 1 a.m., the team had managed to raise the power output of reactor number 4 to 200 megawatts. This was still below prescribed levels, but it seemed the core had stabilized for the moment. The deputy chief engineer and acting supervisor at Chernobyl, Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, decided that the test could resume. In preparation for what was to come, he ordered the automatic emergency shutdown system and power regulating system to be turned off. Water flow was increased to the core, while additional cooling pumps were activated. This decreased the heat in the system and led to low reactivity, necessitating the need to remove more control rods so the reactor could continue to run at 7% power for the next several minutes. At 1:23 and 4 seconds a.m., reactor number 4 began to run as planned. However, at 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., pressure began to build in the core. A series of warning lights started to flash. One of the operators initiated an emergency shutdown, but several control rods jammed as they entered the core. An out-of-control chain reaction began to occur in the reactor. At 1:23 and 58 seconds a.m. on April 26, 1986, the chain reaction reached critical levels, and there was an explosion in reactor number 4. This was immediately followed by a second explosion that blew the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor and shot a radioactive fireball into the sky, briefly illuminating the surrounding area as if it were the middle of the day. The explosion in reactor number 4 caused a massive disruption in energy output. Power fluctuated throughout the plant. The explosion ejected hundreds of tons of irradiated dust into the air as chunks of radioactive graphite hurtled across the surrounding landscape. Radiation began to spew out of the exposed reactor like smoke rising from a volcano. At least 28 people were killed in the initial explosion, and 100 more were seriously injured out of the 600 workers present at the plant that night. 134, including the operators running the test gone wrong, received between 0.8 and 16 grays of radiation, or about 80 to 1,600 rads. This high dose of radiation resulted in all of them developing symptoms of radiation poisoning soon after the accident. 28 died within 3 months of the reactor exploding. Nuclear engineers and scientists from across the Soviet Union who were consulted about the Chernobyl disaster warned the leadership that as long as the core was exposed and the fire within it continued to burn, more and more radioactive material would be spewed into the air and swept across the region. At 10 a.m. on April 27th, the Soviets began flying transport helicopters loaded with sand, boron, lead, and dolomite over the exposed core of reactor number 4. These substances were dropped into the hole to suppress the fire and contain some of the radiation. At this point, the radioactive particles had been spewing out of the reactor for over 24 hours. On April 29th, U.S. spy satellites confirmed the damage sustained by the Chernobyl power plant was much worse than the Soviets were letting on. Reactor number 4 was completely exposed, and around 30% of the power plant's 190 metric tons of uranium had been ejected into the atmosphere. If the Soviets didn't get the reactor fire under control and contain the radiation leak soon, neighboring nations might be facing a radioactive crisis soon. On May 4th, a new set of containment crews started to work at Chernobyl and began pumping liquid nitrogen underneath the reactor to cool it down. A total of 800,000 people, referred to as liquidators, were involved in the arduous job of containment and cleanup around the power plant. They needed to remove any debris blown off the structure as the initial explosions ripped through the facility. Entire villages near the power plant were bulldozed, and any animals present in the exclusion zone were shot on sight. Any radioactive rubble or waste was buried deep underground, including the topsoil layer. Then, on May 6, the radioactive emissions being discharged from reactor number 4 decreased dramatically. This was most likely due to the fire in the core finally burning itself out. However, this meant that radioactive emissions were released from the exposed core for 10 straight days. Let's take a deeper dive into the main differences between these events, explaining why Hiroshima and Nagasaki are thriving, while Chernobyl is still uninhabitable. Reason 1. Height and location. Both of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki detonated well above ground level. The failed reactor at Chernobyl, on the other hand, was obviously not floating in the air when it melted down. This fundamental difference in altitude helps explain why the locations in Japan are so vastly different than those in Chernobyl. The atomic bombs that exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated at specific altitudes to maximize the explosion's yield and power. Even if United States military scientists knew about the long-term effects of radiation caused by a nuclear explosion at the time, they would have likely made the same decision of detonating the bombs well above the cities. The reason for this is that the US was not trying to turn Hiroshima and Nagasaki into radioactive wastelands, but it was trying to create as much immediate damage as possible to shock the Japanese leadership into surrendering. The bombs were never meant to be precise or accurate, but instead to decimate the enemy with a single blast. Interestingly, the explosion at Chernobyl was much smaller than those of the bombs dropped on Japan. It's estimated that the explosion at Chernobyl was the equivalent of approximately 225 tons of TNT. Conversely, Little Boy detonated with around 15,000 tons of TNT power, and Fat Man with 21,000 tons. However, even though the explosion at Chernobyl was a fraction of the size of the atomic bombs, it released nearly 400 times as much radioactive material into the atmosphere, along with huge chunks of radioactive debris that were strewn across the landscape. There are 4 types of nuclear blasts, each corresponding to a different height in relation to the ground. The first is a high-altitude burst, which typically occurs when a nuclear explosion occurs 100,000 feet above the ground. In this situation, there's actually little fallout compared to other nuclear explosions, because no debris is kicked up to which radioactive particles can attach themselves. Instead, high-altitude bursts generate large electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs, that can render electronics on the ground or satellites in low Earth orbit inoperable. However, it's worth mentioning that all types of nuclear blasts have this effect. The second category of nuclear blast is the air burst. This is what the atomic bombs dropped on Japan were. Typically, these explosions occur well below 100,000 feet, but still over 1,000 feet above the ground. For example, Little Boy at Hiroshima detonated at an altitude of 1,900 feet, or 579 meters. Fat Man exploded at around 1,650 feet, or 503 meters. This results in the initial blast accelerating towards the ground, resulting in the energy from the explosion being reflected and dispersed outward along the landscape. This outward energy dispersal is similar to when a glass bowl is dropped on a hard surface and the shards radiate outward from the impact site. However, when a nuclear blast is reflected and dispersed outward, it creates superheated, high-powered winds that destroy everything in its path. An airburst tends to kick up some debris into the atmosphere, but not as much as the next type of nuclear blast. This means that the fallout of an air blast is not as long-lasting or as dangerous as what we'll discuss next. The third type of nuclear blast is a surface burst. This is where there's a nuclear explosion at ground level. To be fair, Chernobyl was not a nuclear explosion, but an explosion that occurred due to a runaway chain reaction in a power plant's nuclear core. So this means there was no mushroom cloud or devastating shockwave. However, a huge amount of radioactive material kicked up into the air and spread throughout the region. This is typical of surface blasts because, unlike a high-altitude or air burst, the explosion happens close to the ground, where dirt, dust, and other particles can be ejected into the sky and fall back to Earth hundreds of feet or miles away. The fact that the Chernobyl disaster happened at ground level instead of thousands of feet in the air is one of the main reasons that the surrounding area has remained irradiated for so long. The last type of nuclear blast is the subsurface blast, which occurs below ground. Depending on the depth, this type of explosion can generate huge amounts of radioactive debris if it breaks the surface. However, there's little data on the effects of a subsurface blast, as this type of nuclear explosion has rarely been carried out. Some scientists estimate that around 90% of the radiation generated by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan was pulled up into the atmosphere and never made it to the ground. Unfortunately, since the Chernobyl disaster occurred at ground level, much more of the radiation generated by the exposed core ended up settling in the area around the power plant. However, a large amount also still ended up in the atmosphere and floated over Europe, which was how Sweden and eventually the rest of the world found out about the incident at the Soviet Union power plant in the first place. Reason 2. Quantity and time. Nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors are two very different things. The goal of an atomic bomb is to release as much energy as possible in a short amount of time. This is done by splitting atoms, almost instantly releasing an abundance of energy. In Little Boy, uranium-235 was used to create a nuclear explosion, while Fat Man contained plutonium-239. The Chernobyl power plant also used uranium-235, but in a very different way. In an atomic bomb such as Little Boy, a relatively small amount of uranium is needed to create a nuclear explosion. 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram of U-235 can release the energy equivalent of about 17 kilotons of TNT. Little Boy contained 141 pounds or 64 kilograms of uranium, 80% of which was U-235. However, less than 0.001 kilograms of the uranium was converted directly into energy. The rest was particleized and either swept away by the atmosphere's winds or fell to the ground. When we examine the amount of fissionable material used at Chernobyl, a stark difference becomes quickly apparent. A 1,000 megawatt reactor like that at the Chernobyl power plant requires around 50,000 pounds of enriched uranium per year and produces 54,000 pounds of waste. At the time of the meltdown, Reactor 4 was estimated to have contained just over 4,000 pounds of uranium in its core. When comparing the 141 pounds of uranium-235 contained in Little Boy to the 4,000 pounds of the same substance in the Chernobyl reactor, it becomes clear why so much more radiation was released in the power plant disaster. The other key difference is the amount of time that the uranium was releasing radiation. When the atomic bombs exploded, all the uranium and plutonium were used up almost instantly. However, when the reactor core melted down at Chernobyl, the fuel rods containing U-235 continued to release radiation for 10 days straight. The amount of material in the core and the length of time that it spewed radiation are two major reasons why Chernobyl is still radioactive and devoid of any major human populations today. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the other hand, endured a massive atomic blast that released a huge amount of energy over a short period of time. This caused massive immediate damage, but reduced the long-term impact on those areas. Reason 3. Byproducts. We now need to get into the science of radiation and what is known as half-life to fully understand the differences between Hiroshima and Nagasaki versus Chernobyl. When talking about radioactivity, a half-life refers to the time it takes for a substance to decay into half its initial quantity. For example, if you had 1 pound of plutonium-239, the half-life would be how long it took for the sample to decay into uranium-235, a much more stable substance. The answer for this particular element is 24,000 years. The starting amount of the radioactive material is arbitrary, since the half-life is specific to the substance, not the quantity. As a rule of thumb, the shorter the half-life of a radioactive substance, the more dangerous it is. Therefore, although plutonium-239 emits some radiation, it's not enough to cause serious illness unless huge quantities are ingested or small particles find their way into someone's lungs. However, a substance like iodine-131 has a half-life of only 8 days, which means it decays rapidly and releases a tremendous amount of radiation while doing so. Another highly radioactive element is cesium-137, which has a half-life of 30 years. However, many experts agree that it's only safe to be around areas affected by cesium-137 approximately 300 years after exposure. But how do all of these elements and numbers connect back to Chernobyl and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? At Chernobyl, the radioactive materials that were released from the destroyed reactor were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. It was determined that iodine-131 in particular was extremely lethal. It could easily get into the human body through breathing contaminated air, consumption of leafy greens, or ingesting dairy products. If consumed this way, the iodine would build up in the thyroid gland. This posed a significant risk to infants and children ingesting large amounts of milk and dairy. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation conducted a research study that concluded more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. Some have disputed this, but there's no denying the fact that young children are much more vulnerable to radiation due to their diet and physiology. Hiroshima and Nagasaki also had to contend with some of these more deadly radioactive elements. The difference is that there was just a lot less material in the atomic bombs that could be converted into these more radioactive elements than in the Chernobyl reactor core. Both Little Boy and Fat Man released their energy within seconds, and that was it. Some radioactive particles fell to Earth or attached themselves to dust and debris, but many others drifted away and stayed in the atmosphere or fell into the ocean. The uranium-235 and plutonium-239 that remained after the blast have half-lives of 700 million years and 24,000 years respectively, meaning they emit very low levels of radiation. In fact, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki currently have the same levels of radiation as everywhere else on the planet that has never been affected by a nuclear catastrophe. Let's be clear about what we've just discussed. We're not saying that the effects of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not comparable to what happened at Chernobyl. In fact, the opposite argument could easily be made. Over 200,000 people died as a direct result of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, compared to the 60 or so people who died at Chernobyl. Any number of lives lost is a tragedy. Still, when we compare sheer numbers, there is no other nuclear incident in history that can compare to the death and destruction caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the atomic bombs dropped by the United States. There were and still are long-lasting effects of the atomic bombs in Japan, but due to a lack of understanding of how radiation exposure could affect the human body at the time, rebuilding the cities began almost immediately after the end of World War II. This lack of fear over radiation and its effects allowed the cities to grow rapidly, where they may not have given today's knowledge. At Chernobyl, parts of the exclusion zone are habitable even now, especially on the outskirts of the region. But the fear of being near the power plant is ever present in the minds of the Ukrainians and people worldwide. Chernobyl remains a barren landscape devoid of human settlements because of the amount of radioactive material present in the exposed core and the length of time that the reactor continuously spewed out radiation. However, it's also because of the fear that resulted in a nuclear meltdown during the Cold War. This is why Hiroshima and Nagasaki don't resemble Chernobyl today. Now watch, what if the USA launched a nuclear bomb minute by minute? Or check out Russia's nuke targets.